No one wants to buy dreams from a sidewalk. Jonathan Reed said it with a cold smile as he stood beside the boxes of old books. Then he let out a laugh. "Huh, with nothing but these old books? You really think that, in the middle of Christmas season on busy Boylston Street, people are going to stop and pay money for them?" Annie Carter looked up from where she was kneeling beside the blanket spread across the sidewalk. Tiny snowflakes clung to the shoulders of her worn brown coat. The fingertips of her gray gloves had been patched. Annie took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Some of them are old, sir, but they're still wonderful books." Jonathan looked down at the blanket in front of her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a white man in his 50s, wearing an expensive charcoal wool coat. Annie picked up another small stack of books from the box beside her. "I still have a few that are almost new. There are novels, study guides, and a few paperbacks that are still in very good condition. Would you like to take a look?" Jonathan simply shook his head. "No." Then he let out a dry laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make Annie's face burn. "New? You call these new?" He nudged one of the paperbacks on the blanket with the tip of his shoe. Not hard, but enough to feel insulting. "Look at this. Bent covers, yellowed pages, handwriting inside. You bring out leftover books and call that your future?" Annie tightened her grip on the stack in her hands. "They're my books," she said quietly but firmly, "and I'm not forcing anyone to buy them." "No? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you put up that sign just to make people feel guilty." His eyes moved toward the cardboard sign leaning against a shoebox. "Used books. Please help me pay for college." "I'm not asking for money," Annie replied. "I'm selling books." Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. The words asking for money seemed to strike something that irritated him. Just then, a middle-aged woman wearing a red scarf stepped closer. She picked up The Secret Garden. "How much is this one, dear?" $2, ma'am," Annie answered quickly. "It's a little old, but all the pages are still there." The woman smiled and opened her wallet, but Jonathan spoke first. "You can buy a clean copy inside the bookstore for $10, he said, nodding toward the shop a few doors away. "At least then you know where it came from." The woman hesitated. "Oh," Annie quickly looked at her. "I promise it's mine. I've had it since middle school." But discomfort had already appeared on the woman's face. She put the book back down. "Maybe next time." Then she walked away. Annie silently watched her $2 opportunity disappear into the snowy sidewalk. A few minutes later, a young couple stopped near the textbooks. The young man wore a college hoodie under his jacket, while the woman held 2 cups of hot cocoa. "Do you have any biology books?" the woman asked. "My sister is starting community college next month." "Yes, I do." Annie immediately reached down and pulled out a thick textbook with colorful sticky notes still attached to the edges. "This one is older, but the basics are still useful. I used it for AP biology. $5. The young man flipped through the pages and nodded. "This is actually pretty good." Jonathan gave a faint laugh. "Pretty good if your sister wants outdated information and someone else's notes. Better buy a newer one." The young woman frowned. "We're just looking." "And now you've finished looking," Jonathan replied coldly. The young man paused, then handed the book back to Annie. "Sorry." He avoided her eyes. A little while later, an older black man with a cane slowly approached. He wore a dark blue coat and carried a paper cup of coffee. "Do you have any history books, young lady?" "Yes, sir." Annie picked one up. "There are notes in the margins, but I think they're helpful." The old man smiled. "Good notes can sometimes be worth more than the book itself." Jonathan glanced at it and smirked. If those notes were really valuable, she wouldn't be standing out here selling them in the snow. The smile disappeared from the old man's face. He looked at Jonathan for a few seconds, then turned to Annie. "Keep your head up, young lady." He spoke softly and walked away. Annie placed the book on her lap. Her fingers were trembling now, not just from the cold. "Why are you doing this?" Jonathan slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "Doing what?" "Every time someone wants to buy something, you drive them away." "I'm just helping them save money." "No." Annie's voice became sharper. "You're taking away my chance." Jonathan paused. "I don't know what happened to you today," Annie continued, trying not to cry. "And I don't know who hurt you badly enough to make you stand here and do this to me. But I never did anything to you." His face tightened. For a brief moment, shame almost surfaced. Then pride buried it again. "If you really want to go to college," he said coldly, "maybe don't sell emotions on the street." Annie stayed silent. Around them, Boston kept moving. A family walked by wearing matching Christmas scarves. She suddenly thought of her mother's hands cracked from bleach and dish soap counting money beneath the yellow kitchen light. Then she looked back at Jonathan. "Are you going to buy anything?" He blinked. "What?" "I asked if you're buying anything. A novel, a textbook, anything." Jonathan stared at her in disbelief. "No." "Then please leave." Annie spoke calmly. "I'm trying to sell books." Jonathan's lips tightened. He was used to people falling silent around him. He wasn't used to a girl selling books on the sidewalk asking him to leave. "You think that attitude helps your business?" he asked. Annie looked straight at him. "At least it's better than standing here insulting people." He lowered his voice. "You should be careful talking to strangers. And strangers should be careful how they treat people they don't know." A few pedestrians noticed the tension and quickly walked away. Annie saw it happen again and again. Every time someone seemed ready to stop, Jonathan's presence pushed them away. And that was when she realized the evening was over. Not because the books had no value, but because he had turned this place into somewhere kindness no longer felt safe enough to stop. Without another word, Annie began packing up. The hardcovers first, then the children's books, then the curled paperbacks. She arranged them carefully, even though her hands were shaking. Jonathan watched her. "Giving up already?" "No." Annie placed an old dictionary into the box. "I'm protecting what I have left." "What?" "My time." She folded the cardboard sign in half. The marker ink had blurred from the snow. "Used books. Please help me pay for college." 3 hours. She had sold only $11 worth of books before he arrived. After that, nothing. $2 could pay for a bus ride. $5 could buy lunch on orientation day. $10 could help reduce the balance still flashing red in her student account, a reminder that her dream of college was slowly slipping away. Annie tucked the folded sign under her arm and reached for the last stack of books. She did not look at Jonathan. Just seeing his face would make her anger flare up again, and right now she needed both of her hands to stay steady. The corners of the cardboard boxes had gone soft from the wet sidewalk. If the bottom tore before she made it to the train station, she would lose more than a bad evening. She would lose the last things she still had left to sell. Jonathan was still standing beside her, silent, but he did not leave. That made everything worse. His cruelty had already hurt enough. The fact that he kept standing there, watching her, made Annie feel as if she were still being targeted. "You can go now," Annie said, without lifting her eyes. He let out a breath, not quite a laugh. "Now you're telling me what to do?" "No, sir. I'm asking you not to make this any harder." Jonathan looked down at the books she was packing away. History, literature, biology, a few worn novels with names written inside the covers. They were not trash. He realized that now, even if he was not ready to admit it, those books had been cared for. Annie used both hands to lift a thick dictionary and placed it neatly into the first box. Then she reached for a blue hardcover book, lying near the edge of the blanket. Her glove slipped slightly. The book slid from the pile, dropped onto the wet sidewalk, and fell open face down near Jonathan's shoes. He bent to pick it up before she could stop him. "That one's not for sale," she said quickly. Jonathan picked up the book and almost handed it back, but then his eyes stopped on the cover. The blue cloth had faded with age. The corners were frayed white. An old coffee stain marked the lower edge. The title was nearly worn away, but under the streetlight, the letters were still visible. "A Chance for the Forgotten." Jonathan froze. Annie held out her hand. "Sir, please, that belonged to my mother." His thumb brushed lightly over the author's name at the bottom of the cover. "Jonathan Reed, what are you planning to do with this?" he asked. Annie frowned. "Read it. Keep it. Like I said, it's my mother's book." He slowly opened the cover. On the first page, written in blue ink, were the words, "Ruth Carter, 1998. Beneath that, in smaller pencil handwriting, another line had been added years later. For Annie, when she needs to remember. Jonathan swallowed. He turned a few more pages. Lines had been underlined. Corners had been folded down. A paragraph on the left-hand page had been carefully circled in pencil. His own words stared back at him. "No poor child deserves to be punished simply for being born without enough." He stared at the sentence. At 24, he had written that book in a public library in Worcester because his apartment had no heat, and the librarian had taken pity on him and let him stay until closing. Back then, he believed poverty was not a flaw in someone's character. He believed opportunity was not charity. He believed a person could have nothing and still hold on to their dignity, clean and straight like a freshly pressed shirt. Annie's voice pulled him back to the present. "Can you give it back to me?" Jonathan blinked. His hand was still gripping the book. "I wrote this. She stared at him. What? He turned the cover around so she could see the author's name. I'm the one who wrote this book. Annie was silent for a few seconds. Then her eyes narrowed. Not with wonder, but with suspicion. You're Jonathan Reed? Yes. That Jonathan Reed. He looked at her, and for the first time in his life, being recognized brought him no pleasure at all. Yes. Annie let out a quiet breath, her voice carrying no admiration. Well, isn't that something? What is that supposed to mean? It means my mother kept your book on our kitchen shelf like it was a Bible for people who couldn't afford hope. Her voice did not rise, but it was sharper than a shout. And you stood right here telling people not to buy my books. Jonathan looked back at the marked page. The sentence suddenly seemed larger, almost impossible to avoid. I didn't know. You didn't ask. He closed his mouth. Because that was true. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about kindness, justice, and second chances. Annie stepped closer and held out her hand. Please give it back. Jonathan placed the book in her palm, but his fingers lingered for a moment before he let go, not because he wanted to keep it from her, because handing it back felt like admitting something he was not yet brave enough to say out loud. Annie pressed the book against her chest and continued packing. Jonathan stood there, watching the snow melt on the empty blanket where her books had been. Your mother read it? He asked. She still does. Why? Annie glanced at him. You really don't remember what you wrote? The question struck him harder than he expected. He remembered the title of the book. He remembered the interviews. He remembered the small first check from the publisher. The check that had paid 2 months of rent. He remembered a young reporter once calling him the voice of forgotten America. He remembered believing, back then, that it was a responsibility, not a brand. But the actual pages? He no longer remembered them clearly. Annie placed another stack of books into the box. My mother said she bought this book at a used bookstore before I was born. She was working double shifts then. She said every time she felt like the whole world was laughing at her, she would read one chapter and find the strength to get through one more week. Jonathan looked up at the bright window of the bookstore behind them. What did she mark? He asked. Annie hesitated. A lot. May I see? No. The answer came out quickly. He nodded once. That's fair. Those simple words sounded strange coming from his mouth, especially after everything he had said earlier. Annie closed the first box and reached for the second. It was heavier. She tried to lift it, but the wet cardboard sagged under the weight. Jonathan stepped forward by instinct. Let me help. She pulled the box closer to herself. I've got it. No, you don't. The bottom is about to tear. I said I've got it. He stopped. A few minutes earlier, he might have mistaken her refusal for pride. Now he understood. It was protection. Annie, he said, reading the name written on one of the notebooks near the box. Is that your name? She looked up, her eyes firm. Don't say my name like you know me. I don't. He paused. But I do now. Annie tied a string around the first box. The wind rose, blowing snow against the walls on either side of the street. Her train card was in her coat pocket. Her hands ached. The ride home would be long with 2 heavy boxes. It would be even longer if the wet cardboard split open on the way. She did not want to think about her mother waiting at home, asking how much she had sold that night. Jonathan looked at the money box. A few small bills, a few coins, $11, maybe less. Shame came to him slowly, then all at once. I owe you an apology, he said. Annie kept packing. You owe me a few customers. He almost smiled, but the truth in her words stopped him. Yes, I do. Only then did she look at him. Her eyes were wet, but not weak. That made him feel even worse. If she had cried, he could have easily cast himself as the rescuer, but the anger in her eyes forced him to face what he had done. I was cruel, he said. You were right. What happened to me today had nothing to do with you. Annie said nothing. Jonathan glanced down at the book she was holding tightly against her chest. And I forgot where I came from. That's between you and yourself. No, he said softly. Tonight, I made it your problem. A taxi honked at the corner. Jonathan lowered his voice. How much tuition do you still owe? Annie's face immediately hardened. No, I'm only asking. And I'm not answering. I can help. You can leave. He accepted that. He knew he deserved it. Still, he did not move. Then at least let me make up for what I cost you tonight. Annie gave a tired laugh. What? Now you want to buy all these books? If you're willing to sell them. 5 minutes ago, they weren't good enough for you. 5 minutes ago, I was wrong. It was the first honest thing he had said all night, and Annie heard it. Her voice did not soften, but she stopped tying the string around the box. Jonathan reached into his coat, then stopped before taking out his wallet. Money had always been the language he used when he did not want to do the harder thing. He withdrew his hand and put it back into his pocket. I don't want to insult you again, he said. Then don't. He nodded. May I ask you one question? 1. Why do you want to go to college? Annie turned her face toward Copley Square. Because I want a life where my mother doesn't have to count pain pills before going to work, she said. Because I want to study education policy. Maybe law after that. Because I'm tired of watching people like us being told to wait our turn by people who were already given a place to stand. The sentence sank into Jonathan slowly, painfully. He looked down at the book again, the one Annie was now holding tightly against the front of her coat. A chance for the forgotten. Jonathan did not ask again about the balance. Something in Annie's face told him that another question, even a careful one, would close the door completely. Instead, he stood beside the half-packed boxes, while the snow thickened over Boylston Street, and the people around them moved as if nothing important had happened. To them, it was only a rich man and a young woman near a blanket of used books. To Jonathan, it felt like standing in front of a mirror he had avoided for 25 years. Do you have a ride home? He asked. Annie tied the string around the second box, pulling it tight with her teeth. I have the train. With those? I got them here that way. That doesn't mean you should get them back that way. She gave him a quick look. I'm not getting in your car. I didn't ask you to. He glanced toward the town car, then back at her. I can call a rideshare. You pick the address. I don't need to know it. No. Then let me carry one box to the station. Annie almost laughed. You chased off my customers, insulted my books, then found out one of them had your name on it. Now you want to carry a box? And call that even? No, Jonathan said. Nothing about this is even. That answer quieted her for a moment, though not enough to soften her. She lifted the first box and felt the damp cardboard bend under her fingers. The bottom sagged. Jonathan saw it, and so did she. Pride was one thing. Losing the books on the sidewalk was another. He removed his scarf and crouched, wrapping it under the box like a sling before she could protest. There, now it won't split. Annie stared at the scarf. Dark cashmere, probably worth more than all the books together. You didn't have to do that. I know. You'll ruin it. It's already been used for worse. She did not ask what he meant. His face had changed again, turned inward and tired. The anger that had made him cruel was still somewhere in him, but now it looked smaller, almost childish, beside the shame. Annie took one side of the box. Jonathan took the other. They walked slowly toward the corner. The second box balanced against Annie's hip. The old book, A Chance for the Forgotten, was tucked under her arm, safe against her coat. For half a block neither spoke. A bus hissed at the curb. Someone came out of a restaurant carrying takeout, and the smell of fried onions and warm bread crossed the cold air. Annie's stomach tightened. She had skipped lunch to save money, then told herself she was too nervous to eat. Jonathan noticed the small movement. Have you eaten? I'm fine. That wasn't the question. It's the answer. He accepted that, though not easily. They reached the entrance to Copley Station, and Annie stopped at the top of the stairs. I can take it from here. Jonathan looked down the steps, then at the box. You'll break your neck. I said I can take it. The same older black man with the cane passed them on his way toward the station. He recognized Annie, then Jonathan. His eyes moved to the scarf wrapped around the box. Looks like somebody found manners late, he said. Annie's mouth twitched, despite herself. Jonathan lowered his eyes. Yes, sir. Late is better than never, I hope. The man grunted. Depends what you do after late. Then he tapped his cane against the first step and continued down. Annie watched him go. He's right. I know. She shifted the box against her hip. You keep saying that. Because tonight I'm learning how much I know too late. She looked at him, really looked this time. Not as the man who had mocked her. Not as the name on the book. But as a person caught between who he had been and who he had become. It did not excuse him, but it made him less simple. My mother's apartment is in Roxbury, Annie said. If you're thinking of sending anything, don't. We don't take surprise gifts from strangers. I wasn't thinking that. You looked like you were. I was thinking I'd like to meet her. No. Jonathan nodded. All right. Annie expected him to argue. He didn't. That unsettled her more than if he had pushed. She started down one step, then stopped when the box slipped. Jonathan steadied it with one hand but did not take it from her. Careful. I've got it. I know. There it was again, that careful restraint. He no longer grabbed at control. He waited to be allowed near the problem. Annie hated that part of her noticed. At the bottom of the stairs, the warm, stale air of the station wrapped around them. The platform smelled of damp coats, metal, and coffee. A teenager leaned against the wall with earbuds in. An older woman read a church bulletin. 2 nurses in scrubs compared Christmas shifts. Boston moved underground with the same tired rhythm as above, only without the lights. Annie set the box down near a pillar. This is far enough. Jonathan placed the other box beside it. His scarf was wet now, darkened by slush. He did not reach for it. Your scarf, Annie said. Keep it around the box until you get home. I'm not keeping a rich man's scarf. You're not. You're using it for transportation. She gave him a look. You always talk like that? Like what? Like if you rename something, it becomes less uncomfortable. That one landed. He almost smiled, but the truth of it stopped him. Probably. The train lights appeared in the tunnel. Wind pushed along the platform, lifting the edges of Annie's coat. Jonathan took a business card from his wallet, then hesitated before offering it. She looked at the card but did not take it. I know, he said. You don't want my help. I don't want pity. It isn't pity. You don't know me well enough for it to be anything else. He held the card lower, not forcing it into her hand. Then call it accountability. I damaged something tonight. Not the books. The chance you had to sell them. Let me repair that in a way you choose. The train doors opened with a chime. People stepped out. Others pressed in. Annie had seconds to decide. She took the card, not because she trusted him, but because rent was due, tuition was due, and life did not always give people the luxury of refusing every complicated hand. This doesn't mean anything, she said. It means you have my number. That's all. That's all. She lifted one box. Jonathan started to help with the second, then stopped and waited. Annie gave the smallest nod. He carried it inside and set it by the door. When he stepped back onto the platform, she was already standing between the 2 boxes, the old blue book clutched against her chest. As the doors began to close, Jonathan spoke through the narrowing gap. Annie. She looked up. I'm sorry. This time, he did not say it like a man trying to end a conversation. He said it like a man beginning a debt. Annie held his gaze until the doors shut. The train pulled away, carrying her into the tunnel with the boxes, the ruined scarf, and the book he had once written when he still believed poor people deserved more than lectures from the powerful. Jonathan stood on the platform long after the train disappeared. In his coat pocket, his phone buzzed again and again. His driver. His lawyer. A board member. Maybe the woman who had emptied his trust and left him with a headline waiting to happen. He ignored all of them. By the time he returned to the street, the snow had covered the shape of Annie's blanket on the sidewalk. There was no trace of the books, no sign, no young woman trying to turn old pages into tuition. Only wet pavement, holiday lights, and the bookstore window reflecting his face back at him. For years, Jonathan had kept copies of A Chance for the Forgotten in the lobby of his company, framed behind glass beside photographs of award ceremonies and magazine covers. He had let visitors see the title but not the wound that made him write it. He had turned his hunger into a brand and his compassion into a talking point. Somewhere along the way, he had mistaken being admired for being useful. His town car pulled up beside him. The driver, Mr. Alvarez, stepped out and opened the rear door. He was in his 60s, with careful manners and a bad knee he never mentioned unless the weather made it impossible to hide. Home, Mr. Reed? Jonathan looked toward the station entrance. Not yet. Mr. Alvarez waited. Do you remember that book I wrote years ago? Jonathan asked. The driver's eyebrows lifted. The blue one? Jonathan turned to him. You read it? My wife did. She gave it to our daughter before community college. He paused, choosing his next words with the caution of an employee and the honesty of an older man. It meant something to people. Jonathan looked away. Meant. Past tense. That was what he had done to it. Take me to the office, he said. At this hour? Yes. The driver nodded and closed the door after him. As the car moved through the Christmas traffic, Jonathan watched Boston slide past the window. Restaurants full of warm light. Office towers with wreaths in the lobbies. A church sign offering free supper on Christmas Eve. A woman pushing a stroller with one hand and holding a grocery bag with the other. He had seen these things 1,000 times from the back seat of a car and called it city life. Tonight, each one felt like a page he had skimmed without reading. At his office, the night security guard greeted him with surprise. Jonathan answered politely for once and took the private elevator to the top floor. His corner suite was dark except for the city glow through the glass. On the wall hung the framed first edition of A Chance for the Forgotten. He stood before it for a long time. Then he took it down. The frame was heavier than he expected, or maybe his hands were. He carried it to his desk, opened a drawer, and found an old letter opener. Carefully, almost reverently, he broke the seal on the back of the frame and pulled the book free. Dust clung to the edges. The spine cracked when he opened it. On the first page was a dedication he had not read in years. For everyone who was told to wait outside. Jonathan sat down. He read until the city lights blurred. He read the chapters about hunger, rent, school fees, bus rides, and the quiet humiliation of needing help from people who wanted gratitude before justice. He read sentences that sounded too brave to have come from his own hand. He read until Annie's face returned to him, not as a symbol, not as a lesson, but as a young woman standing in the snow, asking him whether he intended to buy anything or move along. Near dawn, he closed the book and placed Annie's card-sized memory of the evening beside it. $11 in a shoebox. 3 lost customers. And one question he could no longer avoid. If the words still mattered, what was he going to do with them now? Jonathan stayed in his office until morning arrived without ceremony. The sky over Boston shifted from black to a dull winter gray, and the city below began moving again. Delivery trucks, early commuters, coffee shops unlocking their doors, people stepping into another day because bills did not pause for anyone's shame. On his desk lay the old copy of A Chance for the Forgotten, freed from its frame after years of being treated like an award instead of a responsibility. He had read almost the whole thing through the night. Some pages made him wince, not because the writing was bad, but because it was honest. He had written about his mother watering down soup so it would last 2 more meals. He had written about pretending not to hear classmates talk about ski trips. He had written about the first teacher who told him, "Jonathan, poverty is not proof that you are small." He had believed that once. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. Mr. Reed, his assistant, Claire, said carefully, "You missed 4 calls from the board, 2 from legal, and 1 from Miss Whitmore's attorney, Miss Whitmore." The woman who had smiled across wine glasses, praised his generosity, taken his money, and left him feeling like a fool. Yesterday, her name had filled him with humiliation. This morning, it sounded distant, almost childish. He had been robbed of money. Annie was still fighting for a future. "Cancel my morning meetings," he said. Claire paused. "All of them?" "Yes. You have the education summit at 10. Move it. The mayor's office is expecting you. They can expect me tomorrow." Another pause. "Is something wrong?" Jonathan looked at the book. "Yes, but not the way you mean." He ended the call before she could ask more. Then he searched his desk drawer for an old file he had not opened in years. At the bottom, beneath stock certificates and letters from universities, he found a thin folder with a faded label. Worcester Scholarship, 1,999. Inside was a letter printed on cheap paper, folded along the same creases it had carried for decades. The scholarship had been small by any measure he used now, but back then it had meant books, bus fare, a semester he might otherwise have lost. He remembered reading it on the steps outside a diner, because he could not wait until he got home. "Congratulations, Mr. Reed." He ran his thumb over the word. Congratulations. The first official proof that the world had not completely counted him out. A knock came at the door. Claire stepped in, coat still on, tablet in hand, concern written plainly across her face. She was in her late 50s, sharp, loyal, and one of the few people in his life who had learned how to tell him no without asking permission first. "You look terrible," she said. "Good morning to you, too." "I'm serious. So am I." He held up the scholarship letter. "Do we still have the foundation structure from the literacy initiative?" Claire's expression shifted from concern to business. "Yes, it's dormant, but active." "Why?" "I want to create a scholarship fund. You already fund scholarships through 3 universities. No, those are checks with my name on a wall. I want something different. Claire lowered the tablet. Different how? For students who fall through gaps. Working class families. First-generation students. Kids who are told the door is open, then charged a fee to touch the handle. She studied him. This is sudden. It should have happened years ago. That's not an explanation. Jonathan looked at her for a long second. With other employees, he might have given an order and ended it. Claire had earned more than that. Last night I met a young woman selling her books on Boylston Street to pay tuition. I treated her badly. How badly? Badly enough that I don't want to soften it. Claire did not rescue him from the silence. And now you want to fix it with a scholarship. No. He leaned back, tired but clear. That's what I would have done yesterday. Write a check. Make the discomfort disappear. Call it kindness. She won't take pity, and she shouldn't. I want a real process. Independent review. No publicity. No special door with my hand on the knob. Claire's face changed a little, less skeptical now. What's her name? Annie Carter. Do you know her school? Not yet. Tuition amount? She wouldn't tell me. Smart girl. Jonathan almost smiled. Yes. Claire walked to the window, then turned back. If this is real, you need to start with apologies before announcements. I apologized. Once? He said nothing. That's what I thought. She tapped her tablet awake. We can revive the foundation, but it needs a board, criteria, council, compliance. If this fund gives priority to students from underrepresented communities, we need to structure it properly. If you want it clean, it has to be clean from the beginning. Do it. I'll begin. But Jonathan? He looked up. Don't make that young woman the face of your redemption unless she chooses to be. The words struck close enough to hurt. I know. Make sure you do. By noon, the story of Caroline Whitmore's betrayal had begun crawling through the private channels of Boston society. Jonathan saw the messages on his phone and ignored them. He spent the day reading drafts Claire sent him. Scholarship language, foundation options, legal concerns, application requirements. Each document felt too neat compared to the sidewalk, but he understood that good intentions without structure often became another way powerful people congratulated themselves. At 3, he held Annie's business card between his fingers. It was not really a card, just his own card she had taken without promising to call. He had no number for her, no address, and no right to search for her, as if she were a problem he could acquire. All he had was her name, her mother's first name written in the old book, and the memory of the station doors closing between them. Claire returned near 4. We found nothing by crossing lines, she said before he asked. But if she applied to Boston University, the school cannot discuss her account. We can contact the financial aid office generally about establishing emergency scholarships. Do that. And if Annie calls? Jonathan looked at the phone. Put her through, no matter what I'm doing. Annie did not call that day. She did not call the next morning either. In Roxbury, she placed Jonathan's ruined scarf over the back of a kitchen chair and the 2 boxes of books beside the radiator. Their apartment smelled like chicken soup, dish soap, and the lemon cleaner Ruth used when she was worried. The old blue book sat on the table between them. Ruth Carter stood with one hand on her hip, still in her cafeteria uniform, reading Jonathan Reed's name on the cover. You're telling me that man on the sidewalk was him? Annie nodded. The same Jonathan Reed who wrote this? Yes. And he acted like that? Yes. Ruth pulled out a chair and sat down slowly. Her knees had been bothering her again, though she tried not to show it. Lord have mercy. I almost threw the book at him. I'm glad you didn't. We don't have money for bail. Despite herself, Annie laughed, then covered her face. The laugh turned close to tears, but she held it back. Ruth saw. Mothers always saw. How much did you make? $11. Ruth's mouth tightened. Before him? Annie nodded. Ruth reached across the table and touched her daughter's wrist. Baby, I'm okay. No, you're not. Annie looked toward the old scarf. He apologized. Did that put money on your account? No. Then it's a start, not a solution. He asked how much I owed. I didn't tell him. Good. Annie looked surprised. You don't think I should have? I think a man who hurts you doesn't get to buy his way into feeling better before you've had time to breathe. Ruth slid the book closer and opened to a page marked long ago. Her handwriting filled the margin beside a paragraph about dignity. But I also think God can send help in packages we don't like. I don't want to be somebody's charity story. You are not a charity story. You are my daughter. Annie looked down. Ruth continued, her voice lower now. And pride is a good coat, Annie, but it won't keep you warm if you refuse every blanket. The apartment went quiet. Outside, a bus sighed at the corner. Somewhere upstairs, a child ran across the floor, and a woman called for him to slow down. Annie picked up Jonathan's business card. She had placed it face down on the table as if that made it less powerful. What if he's just guilty? Then let him sit with it. What if he really wants to help? Then make him respect you while he does. Annie turned the card over. Jonathan Reed Global Education. The letters were raised, clean, expensive. She thought of him standing in the snow, saying, I wrote this, as if the sentence had broken something open inside him. I don't trust him, she said. You don't have to trust him to ask questions. That night, long after Ruth left for her cleaning shift, Annie sat alone at the kitchen table with the old book open in front of her. She read the passage Jonathan had found on the sidewalk. No poor child should ever be punished for being born without privilege. Beneath it, her mother had written years ago, remember this when the world gets loud. Annie touched the words. Then she picked up her phone and typed a message to the number on the card. This is Annie Carter. You said you wanted to repair what you damaged. I'm willing to talk. Not at your office. Public place. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. Boston Public Library Cafe. She stared at it for a full minute before pressing send. Across the city, Jonathan was alone in his office when his phone lit up. He read the message twice. Then a third time. Claire, who had been gathering papers near the door, watched him carefully. Is it her? Yes. What did she say? Jonathan set the phone down as if it were fragile. She's willing to talk, he said. Claire gave a small nod. Then don't waste the chance. Jonathan looked at the old scholarship letter on his desk, then at the unframed copy of his book. For the first time in a long while, he did not think about reputation, loss, or the woman who had made him feel foolish. He thought about a young woman in the snow who had asked him to move along because she was trying to sell books, and tomorrow, if she allowed him one more conversation, he intended to listen before he spoke. At 4 o'clock the next afternoon, Annie stood outside the Boston Public Library Cafe with her coat buttoned to her throat and her mother's old book held against her side. She had arrived 15 minutes early, not because she was eager, but because being early gave her time to leave if her courage changed its mind. Around her, people carried laptops, paper cups, and canvas bags printed with book quotes. A retired couple argued gently about whether to sit near the window. A college student in a BU hoodie typed with one hand and ate a muffin with the other. The place smelled of coffee, cinnamon, and wet wool. Jonathan arrived at exactly 4. No driver beside him. No assistant. No security man hovering nearby. He wore a plain dark coat, and for the first time Annie noticed how tired he looked. The sharpness was still in his face, but it no longer seemed aimed at her. He stopped a few feet away. Thank you for coming. I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you. That doesn't make it better. No, he said. It doesn't. That was a better beginning than she expected, though she did not show it. She nodded toward a small table near the side wall. We can sit there. Jonathan waited for her to choose the chair first. Annie noticed. She also noticed that he did not offer to buy her coffee. Maybe Claire had warned him. Maybe shame had. Either way, she appreciated not having to refuse something in the first 30 seconds. They sat across from each other. Annie placed a chance for the forgotten on the table between them like a witness. Jonathan looked at it, then at her. I read my copy last night. Your copy? The one I kept framed in my office. Framed? He gave a small, embarrassed nod. Yes, that sounds about right. It was worse than it sounds. I doubt that. He almost smiled, but let it pass. You're probably right. For a moment, neither spoke. A barista called out an order for a man named Frank. The retired couple found a seat by the window. Annie opened the book and turned to a page marked with a yellow sticky note so old it barely held. My mother marked this, she said. She used to read it to me when I was younger. Jonathan leaned forward but did not touch the page. Annie read the underlined sentence aloud. Opportunity is not a gift from the powerful. It is a debt society owes to every child it has ignored. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. You wrote that, Annie said. I did. Did you mean it? The question was quiet, but it did not feel small. Jonathan looked past her for a second, toward the tall windows and the gray winter light beyond them. When I wrote it, yes. And now? Now I'm trying to figure out when I stopped living like I meant it. Annie studied him. She wanted to dismiss the answer as polished, but there was no polish in his voice. It sounded rough, incomplete, and that made it harder to reject. I didn't come here to make you feel better, she said. I know. I'm not going to sit in front of a camera and say you saved me. I'm not asking you to. If your company wants a story, find somebody else. My company doesn't know about this meeting. She tilted her head. Your assistant does. Claire knows because she keeps me from doing stupid things in expensive ways. That sounds like a full-time job. It is. Annie's mouth moved before she could stop it, almost a smile. Jonathan saw it and wisely did not react too much. He folded his hands on the table. I want to explain what I'm offering, and then you can say no. I can say no before you explain. You can. Good. He nodded. I'm setting up a scholarship fund through my foundation. Independent board. Clear criteria. Students from working-class families. First-generation applicants. Students who are short of tuition after aid and scholarships. It would not be only for you. Annie's eyes narrowed. So I'm the reason, but not the whole point. Yes. That's convenient. It's necessary. If I only write you a check, I make your private struggle into my private apology. That helps one person and flatters me. You were right last night. You are not my redemption project. Hearing her own words returned without mockery unsettled her. She looked down at the book. And how does this help me? You could apply. Apply? Yes, same as anyone else. She leaned back. You're telling me that after ruining the only sales I had yesterday, your solution is homework? Jonathan accepted the hit. Partly. That's bold. I know. But if I hand you money, people can say you got it because I felt guilty. If you apply and an independent board selects you, then the record says you earned it. I already earned college. I believe you. You don't know that. I know enough to ask for the chance to see the rest. Annie looked toward the cafe counter. A mother was wiping hot chocolate from her child's sleeve. The child complained. The mother sighed, then kissed his forehead anyway. It made Annie think of Ruth leaving before sunrise with her lunch wrapped in foil, telling Annie to lock the door behind her and not forget she was loved. That was the part strangers never saw. They saw a need. They did not see the labor under it. What would the application ask? She said. Jonathan did not reach for papers right away. Grades, acceptance letter, financial need, recommendation, a personal essay. About what? What chance would change for you? Annie gave a short laugh. That sounds like something written by people who already had chances. You can write that in the essay. I might. You should. She glanced at him. You wouldn't mind? If the board can't handle the truth, I chose the wrong board. Annie sat with that. She wanted to stay angry because anger was simple and clean. This was messier. He had been cruel. That did not vanish. But he was sitting in front of her without demanding forgiveness, offering a process instead of a rescue, and that made the choice harder. How fast? She asked. The fund can't be fully built by your tuition deadline. Claire is working on an emergency bridge award under the Foundation's existing literacy program. Same rules, reviewed by 3 people who are not me. Who are they? A retired principal from Dorchester, a community college financial aid director, and a pastor from Roxbury if she agrees. Annie looked up. Roxbury? I thought someone on the board should understand the neighborhood without reading a report about it. Don't make Roxbury sound like a charity exhibit. You're right, I'm sorry. He corrected himself quickly, not defensively. Annie noticed that too. She tapped the cover of the book. My mother said help that takes your voice isn't help. She's right. And if I apply, I keep my voice. Yes. If reporters call, you don't use my name. Not without your written permission. If your board rejects me, you don't step in. Jonathan hesitated, just long enough for Annie to see the old habit in him, the need to fix, command, override. Then he breathed once and said, I don't step in. And if I win, you win because the board says you meet the criteria, not because you feel bad, not because I feel bad. Annie looked at the old book again. You understand I'm still angry. I'd be more worried if you weren't. That answer finally loosened something in her shoulders. She was tired. Tired of calculating. Tired of defending her dignity like it was a disputed charge. Tired of adults telling her to be grateful for systems that made survival feel like a test. She opened her backpack and pulled out a folder, creased but organized. I brought copies. Acceptance letter. Aid package. transcript, work schedule. Not because I trust you. Because my mother said if I went to the meeting, I should go prepared. Jonathan looked at the folder but made no move to take it. May I? She slid it across the table. He opened it carefully. The first page was her acceptance letter. Dear Miss Carter, congratulations. He remembered his own letter. The diner steps. The word that had once made him feel seen. Your grades are excellent, he said. I know. He looked up. Annie held his gaze. I'm not being rude. I worked for them. You're right, he said. You did. He turned another page and saw the balance. The number was not large by the standards of his life. It was painfully large by the standards of hers. That almost made it worse. So little, from one side of the table. So much, from the other. He closed the folder gently. I'll have Claire send the application tonight. You can submit it directly to the review board. And you? I'll know only what they tell me. Annie picked up the book and stood. Then send it. Jonathan stood too, slower. Annie. She paused. I can't undo yesterday. No. But I can make sure yesterday is not the last word. She looked at him for a long moment. That depends on what you do when nobody's watching. Then she left the cafe, walking past the tall windows into the cold, her backpack over one shoulder and the old blue book pressed under her arm. Jonathan remained at the table after she was gone. The chair across from him was empty, but the conversation stayed. He took out his phone and called Claire. She's applying, he said when Claire answered. Good. She brought everything. Organized. Prepared. She's sharper than half the executives I met this year. I'm not surprised. Jonathan looked at the folder in front of him, then toward the door Annie had walked through. Claire, make sure this process is clean. It will be. No shortcuts. No favor disguised as fairness. Understood. And Claire? Yes? If she wins, I want it to be because she made it impossible not to choose her. Claire's voice softened. Then let her. Jonathan ended the call and sat quietly as the cafe continued around him. For once, he did not feel the urge to direct the room, fill the silence, or turn guilt into action before it had taught him anything. Outside, Annie walked toward the train station, the cold bit her cheeks, but her steps were steady. She still did not trust Jonathan Reed, not fully. Maybe not even halfway. But in her backpack was a folder copied twice. In her hand was a book her mother had believed in. And ahead of her was a door that had not opened yet. This time, if it opened, Annie intended to walk through it standing upright. The application arrived in Annie's inbox that evening, just as Ruth was leaving for her cleaning shift. It came from the foundation, not from Jonathan's personal email, and that mattered more than Annie wanted to admit. The subject line read, Emergency Bridge Scholarship Application. No photograph of Jonathan. No speech about generosity. No promise. Just instructions, deadlines, and a note at the bottom naming the 3 reviewers. Ruth stood by the door with her coat half-zipped. You going to fill it out tonight? Annie sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, the old blue book beside her. I have to. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. Yes, I do. Ruth gave her a look that had stopped Annie from lying since kindergarten. Eat first. I'm not hungry. You said that yesterday. I was busy yesterday. You're busy every day. Ruth walked back to the stove, lifted the lid from a small pot, and spooned chicken soup into a bowl. A dream doesn't run better on an empty stomach. Annie wanted to argue, but the smell of broth, celery, and black pepper reached her before pride could. She took the bowl. Ruth kissed the top of her head, adjusted the scarf around her own neck, and paused at the door. Bobby? Annie looked up. Don't write what you think rich folks want to hear. Write what you know. After Ruth left, the apartment settled into its usual night sounds. The radiator clicking, a neighbor's television murmuring through the wall, tires hissing on the wet street below. Annie opened the essay prompt. What would a fair chance change for you? She stared at the question for nearly 10 minutes. Then she began. A fair chance would not make me special. It would make me free to work for what I have already earned. She stopped, read it twice, and kept going. She wrote about her mother waking before dawn to prepare school lunches for children whose parents never knew the woman serving them was fighting to keep her own daughter in school. She wrote about counting textbook costs like grocery money. She wrote about people who mistook poverty for lack of effort because effort was invisible when it happened before sunrise and after midnight. She did not mention Jonathan by name. She did not mention the sidewalk until the final paragraph. Last night, I sold my books because I did not want to let a bill decide the size of my future. I am not asking this committee to feel sorry for me. I am asking you to recognize that talent without access is a locked room. I do not want someone to carry me through the door. I want the key I have worked for. When she finished, it was after midnight. Ruth was not home yet. Annie saved the file, attached the documents, and hovered over the submit button. She thought of Jonathan's face in the cafe when he saw the balance. She thought of his apology on the train platform. She thought of her mother's warning. Help that takes your voice isn't help. Then she clicked submit. Across the city, Jonathan was not allowed to see the application. Claire made sure of that. The next morning, she walked into his office with a folder and placed it on the far side of his desk. Process update, she said, not content. Jonathan looked at the folder as if it contained a verdict. She submitted? Yes. When? Late last night. Can I know whether everything was complete? You can know it was complete. He sat back. That's all? That's all. He almost objected. Claire waited, calm as a school principal. Finally, he nodded. Good. The reviewers meet tomorrow afternoon. Reverend Denise Walker agreed to serve. Dr. Milton Hayes, retired principal from Dorchester, confirmed this morning. The third is Karen Liu from Bunker Hill Community College Financial Aid. Jonathan knew all three by reputation. None of them would be impressed by his name. That gave him a strange relief. Thank you, he said. Claire studied him. You're learning. Don't sound too surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm cautious. He accepted that. Fair. By mid-afternoon, Claire had turned his office into a temporary planning room. Legal pads, foundation documents, compliance notes, and draft criteria covered the conference table. Jonathan had asked for simplicity. Claire had answered with reality. If this becomes permanent, she said, pointing at a page, we need yearly funding, independent governance, and public criteria. You can seat it personally. But it cannot function like your private conscience with a letterhead. Jonathan glanced at the line item. How much to launch properly? For the first year? Enough to help 25 students without making promises we can't keep. Make it 50. Claire did not blink. Money is not the hard part. I know. Do you? He looked up. She softened, but only slightly. The hard part is staying with it after the emotion fades. Jonathan looked toward the unframed copy of A Chance for the Forgotten on his desk. Then build it so it doesn't depend on my mood. That, Claire said, is the first sensible thing you've said all week. On Thursday, the three reviewers met in a modest conference room at the Foundation's old literacy office, not at Reed Global headquarters. Claire had insisted on neutral ground. There were no portraits of Jonathan, no donor wall, no polished marble lobby, just coffee in a cardboard box, a plate of grocery store cookies, and a stack of applications for the Emergency Bridge Award. Annie's was one of 7. Reverend Denise Walker arrived first, a tall black woman in her 60s with silver hair cut close and a voice that could comfort a grieving widow or stop a lying councilman. Dr. Hayes came next, wearing a tweed cap and carrying reading glasses in his shirt pocket. Karen Liu brought a laptop, a thermos, and the patient expression of someone who had spent 20 years explaining financial aid forms to frightened families. Claire greeted them. Thank you for doing this on short notice. Dr. Hayes removed his cap. Short notice is what poor families live on. Karen nodded. Let's begin. They read in silence at first. Claire stayed only to answer process questions, then stepped outside. She had made one rule plain. Jonathan Reed would not enter the room, call the room, or influence the room. When they reached Annie's application, Reverend Walker read the essay twice. Dr. Hayes underlined one sentence. Karen checked the numbers, then checked them again. She has the academic record, Karen said. She has the need, Dr. Hayes added. Reverend Walker tapped the essay. And she has the fire. Karen looked at the page. The gap is small compared to some cases. Dr. Hayes gave her a tired smile. Small gaps stop big lives all the time. They sat with that because all three knew it was true. By the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. Annie Carter would receive the Emergency Bridge Scholarship. 2 other students would also receive awards from the same pilot fund. Claire took the signed recommendation, thanked each reviewer, and called Jonathan only after everything was complete. He answered on the first ring. Well, he asked, then caught himself. Sorry. What is the decision? Claire let the correction stand. The board selected 3 recipients. Jonathan closed his eyes. Annie? Yes. He exhaled slowly. Because? Because she met the criteria. Because her file was strong. Because the reviewers said no one had to make excuses for choosing her. Jonathan sat down. He had not realized he was standing. Can I call her? No. He opened his eyes. No? The notification comes from the foundation. Formal email first, then follow-up call from Karen Liu. Not you. Right, he said. Of course. Claire's voice eased. You can be glad, Jonathan. Just don't make yourself the center of it. I'm trying. I know. Annie received the email while shelving canned goods during her evening shift at Henderson's grocery. Her phone buzzed in her back pocket, but she did not check it until break, because Mr. Henderson hated phones on the floor unless someone was bleeding. In the back room, between a humming refrigerator and a stack of paper towel boxes, she opened the message. Dear Miss Carter, congratulations. After independent review, you have been selected to receive an emergency bridge scholarship from the Forgotten Chance Fund. For a second, the words did not arrange themselves into meaning. She read them again. Congratulations. Selected. Emergency bridge scholarship. The amount listed below covered the balance. All of it. Annie sat down on an overturned milk crate. Her breath shook once, then twice. She pressed the phone against her chest and looked up at the ceiling because if she looked at anything human, she might fall apart. Her coworker Marisol pushed through the swinging door with a box cutter in one hand. You okay? Annie tried to speak. Nothing came out. Marisol's face changed. Annie? Annie turned the phone toward her. Marisol read the email, then covered her mouth. Oh my God. I got it, Annie whispered. Marisol dropped onto the crate beside her and hugged her with one arm, careful not to crush the phone. Girl, you got it. Annie laughed then. But the laugh broke into tears before she could stop it. She cried quietly, the way people cry when relief arrives after they had already taught themselves not to expect it. That night, when Ruth came home, Annie was waiting at the kitchen table with the laptop open. Ruth stepped in, tired enough to move slowly, her work shoes damp from the sidewalk. Something wrong? Ruth asked. Annie shook her head. Come here. Ruth set down her bag and leaned over the screen. She read the email. Her hand went to the edge of the table. Read it again, she said. Annie did. Ruth sat down slowly, one hand over her mouth. For a moment, she looked older than she allowed herself to be. Then she reached for Annie and pulled her close. My baby's going to school, Ruth said into her daughter's hair. I was already going, Annie whispered, crying again. I know, but now you can breathe while you go. They stayed that way for a while, in the small kitchen with the old book on the table and the radiator knocking against the cold. No cameras, no speeches, no rich man in the doorway. Just a mother and daughter holding the first clear proof that the door had opened. Across Boston, Jonathan received no call from Annie that night. He did not expect one. Instead, Claire sent him a one-line message after the notifications went out. The award has been accepted. Jonathan read it while standing alone in his office. He looked at the city lights, then at the old blue book on his desk. For the first time since the sidewalk, he allowed himself to feel glad without reaching for credit. The next morning, he signed the documents to permanently establish the Forgotten Chance Fund. 50 students for the first year. Independent board. Public criteria. No donor photo on the application page. Claire reviewed the final copy, then looked up. Are you sure about removing your name from the front? Yes. It will still be public record. That's fine, but the first thing students see shouldn't be my face. What should they see? Jonathan thought of Annie's sign bending in the snow. The requirements, he said, and the words, you earned the right to apply. Claire smiled faintly. That sounds like the man who wrote the book. Jonathan picked up his pen. Not yet, he said. Then he signed. The first week after Annie accepted the scholarship was quiet enough to feel unreal. No one at Henderson's grocery knew unless Marisol told them, and Marisol had promised not to, though she kept grinning every time Annie passed the cereal aisle. Ruth still went to work before sunrise and came home after dark. But she moved with a little less fear in her shoulders. The tuition balance no longer sat between them at dinner like an unpaid sentence. Annie checked the student portal 3 times a day anyway, just to see the zero. On Friday morning, that quiet broke. Annie was in the apartment kitchen packing a turkey sandwich for her shift when her phone began buzzing on the table. At first, she thought it was Marisol. Then another message came. Then another. By the time she picked it up, 12 notifications crowded the screen. Did you see this? Is this you? Girl, call me. A link sat beneath one of the messages. The headline opened before Annie could prepare herself. Billionaire Jonathan Reed launches scholarship after encounter with poor black girl selling books on Boston's sidewalk. Her stomach tightened. She read the first paragraph standing beside the sink. Sandwich forgotten in her hand. The article did not use her full name, but it did not need to. It mentioned Boylston Street, used books, college tuition, a young black student, and Reed's dramatic change of heart. There was no lie large enough to point at cleanly, which made it worse. The story had taken the bones of truth and dressed them in pity. Ruth came in from the bedroom tying her work shoes. What happened? Annie handed her the phone. Ruth read silently. Her face changed in small degrees, first confusion, then anger. Did you give them permission? No. Did he? I don't know. Ruth looked at the screen again. Poor black girl, she said, each word heavier than the last. They couldn't even call you a student first. Annie took the phone back and scrolled. The article included a photo of Jonathan outside Reed Global headquarters, not Annie, but the comments had already begun doing what comments did. At least someone helped her. Why is race always mentioned? Selling books? Sounds staged. Good for him. People like her need guidance. Annie set the phone down before she threw it. I have to go to work. You don't have to pretend this didn't hurt. I know it hurt. I still have to go to work. Ruth stepped closer and took the sandwich from her hand, wrapping it properly in foil. Listen to me. People will talk like they know you because they read 3 paragraphs. Don't help them by forgetting who you are. Annie nodded, but her throat had gone tight. By noon, the story had spread beyond Boston business pages. A local radio host joked about sidewalk scholarships. A morning show asked whether billionaires were doing enough for education. A blogger posted a blurry picture of the spot on Boylston Street where Annie had sold her books, as if the sidewalk itself were evidence. At Henderson's, 2 customers looked at her too long. One whispered to another near the soup display. Annie kept scanning cans, bagging groceries, and saying, "Have a good day," with a voice that did not belong to how she felt. Near the end of her shift, Mr. Henderson called her into the small office by the loading dock. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s who had owned the store for 30 years and still wore a tie under his apron on Fridays. "Annie," he said gently. "A reporter called the store." She stood still. "What did you tell them?" "That my employees are not for sale." He leaned back in his chair. Then I hung up. Some of the pressure in her chest eased. "Thank you. You want tomorrow off?" "No, I need the hours." He looked at her over his glasses. "You sure?" "No," Annie said, "but I'm coming." He nodded as if that was a complete answer. "Then come. And if anyone bothers you, send them to me." When she left work, Marisol was waiting outside in a puffer jacket, arms folded against the cold. "I saw the article." Everybody saw the article. "Not everybody knows you." That didn't stop them. Marisol walked beside her toward the bus stop. People love turning someone else's struggle into a snack. Annie gave a tired laugh. "That's one way to put it. You want me to fight somebody?" "No." "You sure?" "I've got time before dinner." This time Annie really laughed, but it faded quickly. "I'm not embarrassed that I needed money. I'm embarrassed by how they're saying it. Like I was sitting there waiting for a rich man to rescue me." "You weren't." "I know." "Then make sure he knows you know." Jonathan did know. He learned about the article from Claire, who entered his office without knocking, tablet in hand and anger in her stride. "Tell me you didn't authorize this." Jonathan looked up from a foundation document. "Authorize what?" Claire placed the tablet in front of him. He read the headline once. His face hardened. "No, that's what I thought." "Where did they get it?" "Someone at the gala saw you on Boylston Street. Someone else heard about the fund. A board member talked too much, probably trying to make you look generous after the Whitmore mess." Jonathan kept reading. Poor black girl. Dramatic change of heart. Sidewalk encounter. His hand closed into a fist on the desk. Call legal. Already did. They can ask for corrections but not kill it. Most of it is vague enough to survive. Annie didn't agree to this. No, she didn't. He reached for his phone. Claire stopped him with one word. "Careful. I need to apologize." "You do. But don't call her in the middle of a media storm and make her manage your guilt." Jonathan lowered the phone. He hated that she was right. "What do I do?" "You issue a statement. Not about Annie. About the fund. You make it clear no recipient will be used publicly without consent. You correct the language. And you do not praise yourself. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, Boston looked orderly from above, traffic in lines, people like moving dots. It was always easier to misunderstand lives from high floors. Draft it, he said. Use plain language. Claire folded her arms. You draft it. He turned back. You wrote the book, she said. You can write an apology that doesn't sound like a press release. Jonathan sat down and opened a blank document. It took him longer than he expected. Every first sentence sounded like reputation management. Every second sentence sounded like excuse. Finally, he typed the only thing that felt clean. Yesterday, a story was published about the Forgotten Chance Fund and a student connected to its beginning. That student did not ask to be made into a public symbol, and she does not owe the public her story. He kept going. The fund exists because too many students earn a place in college and still face a closed door at the bursar's office. Any student supported by this fund will be treated as a scholar, not a charity case. No recipient's name, image, race, or private hardship will be used for publicity without consent. If public conversation about this fund begins with pity instead of respect, then we have already failed the students we claim to serve. He stopped, then added one more line. Opportunity is not rescue, it is repair. Claire read it over his shoulder. For once, she did not change much. Post it, she said. Within an hour, the statement was everywhere the article had gone. Some people praised it, some mocked it, some accused Jonathan of trying to look humble in public, which, in another week, might have been true. But Annie read the statement sitting on the bus home, and although she did not forgive him, she noticed what he had not done. He had not named her, he had not described her, he had not called her brave, deserving, inspiring, or any of the words adults used when they wanted pain to sound useful. He had drawn a line. When she arrived home, Ruth had already seen it. She was standing by the stove, stirring rice and beans. Well, Ruth asked. Annie set her bag down. He said the right thing. That's not what I asked. Annie leaned against the counter. I'm still mad. Good. Anger keeps a record. But I'm less mad than I was this morning. Ruth nodded. That means the record got one correction. After dinner, Annie opened her laptop and checked her email. There were messages from the university, from the foundation, from people at school she had not heard from in months. One subject line stopped her. Interview request. Your story could inspire thousands. She deleted it. Another came from a student admitted else. They're calling you scholarship girl in one of the group chats. I told them to shut up. Annie stared at the words. Scholarship girl. There it was, clean and small, the kind of label people could toss lightly because they did not have to carry it. She closed the laptop. The next morning, she took the train to campus for an admitted student's financial aid session. She had considered skipping it, but Ruth told her, don't let strangers chase you from rooms you earned. So she went. The campus looked different now that she knew she could attend. Brick buildings rose against the cold sky. Students hurried with backpacks and coffee. Parents stood near maps, pretending not to be nervous. Annie walked through them with her folder held close. Inside the financial aid office, a woman at the front desk looked up. Name? Annie Carter. The woman typed, then smiled with professional brightness. Oh, you're the student from the Reed Scholarship. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Annie felt two parents nearby glance over. I'm a student admitted to Boston University, Annie said, and I'm here for the aid session. The woman's smile faltered. To her credit, she corrected herself. Of course. Room 204, down the hall. Annie walked away before anger made her say more. In room 204, she took a seat near the back. A white mother in a camel coat leaned toward another parent and whispered, not softly enough. That must be her. Annie opened her folder and looked straight ahead. A few minutes later, a young man in the row ahead turned around. He was black, maybe a year older, with a Howard University sweatshirt under his jacket. People always think whispering makes them invisible, he said. Annie looked at him despite herself. He smiled. I'm Marcus, transfer student, also apparently a financial aid mystery to some folks. Annie's shoulders loosened a little. Annie, I know. Her face tightened. He lifted both hands. Not like that. I mean, I saw the article. Then I saw the statement. Figured there was a real person somewhere underneath all the noise. There is. Good, just checking. She almost smiled. The session began. A counselor explained payment plans, work-study options, appeals, deadlines. Annie took notes, not because she needed every detail, but because taking notes made her feel like herself again. Halfway through, the woman in the camel coat raised her hand. Will special scholarships like the Reed Fund reduce opportunities for other students? The room went quiet. The counselor began to answer, but Annie heard her own chair move before she fully decided to stand. I can answer part of that, she said. Every face turned. Her heart beat hard, but her voice stayed level. The scholarship I received didn't take anything from your child. It helped cover a gap after grants, work, savings, and my mother's sacrifices still weren't enough. I didn't get admitted because of a headline. I got admitted before anyone knew my name. So if we're talking about opportunity, maybe we should ask why so many students have to prove they deserve help, after already proving they deserve a seat. No one spoke. Marcus gave one quiet clap, then another student joined. Not many, just enough. The counselor cleared her throat. Thank you, Annie. That was well said. Annie sat down, hands cold, face warm. She did not feel victorious. She felt awake. That evening, Jonathan received an email from the financial aid director. It did not share private details. Only a sentence passed along with permission from someone in the room. Miss Carter spoke today with remarkable clarity about dignity and access. Jonathan read it twice. Then he forwarded it to Claire with no comment. Claire replied 1 minute later. Good. Now remember, she is not becoming strong. She already was. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. The old habit in him wanted to feel proud, as if Annie's courage proved something about his fund. But Claire's line stopped him. Annie had been strong before he met her. Strong on the sidewalk. Strong when he mocked her. Strong when she asked him to move along. The fund had not made her worthy. It had only removed one weight from her back. Across town, Annie sat at the kitchen table while Ruth braided her hair for church the next morning. The old blue book lay open beside them, its pages worn from years of hands. You spoke up today, Ruth said, parting another section carefully. I was scared. That's usually when speaking counts. Annie looked at the window, where the reflection showed her mother's tired hands working with practiced care. I don't want to be angry all the time. You won't be. How do you know? Because anger is a match. It can light the stove, or it can burn the house. You're learning the difference. Annie sat still while Ruth finished the braid. Outside, Boston moved into another cold night. Somewhere downtown, Jonathan Reed sat with an old book and a new fund. Somewhere online, strangers still argued about a story they did not own. But in a small kitchen in Roxbury, Annie Carter understood something that would matter for the rest of her life. Justice did not always begin in courtrooms. Sometimes it began in a room where someone expected you to stay quiet, and you didn't. That Sunday morning, Annie carried a chance for the forgotten to New Hope Baptist Church because Ruth asked her to bring something to read between services. The old book fit awkwardly in her purse, its corners pressing against her wallet and a packet of tissues. Ruth noticed but said nothing. Mothers sometimes understood that a daughter needed to carry certain things until she decided whether they were armor or weight. The church basement smelled of coffee, pancakes, floor cleaner, and old hymnals. Volunteers moved between folding tables, setting out paper plates and pitchers of orange juice for the community breakfast. Retired men in pressed suits talked near the bulletin board. Children chased each other around chairs until one of the deacons told them to walk like they had home training. Annie helped stack napkins beside Mrs. Laverne, who had known Ruth since Annie was small and still called everyone under 30 baby, whether they liked it or not. You holding up? Mrs. Laverne asked. Annie gave the answer people gave in church basements when they did not want to become the subject of a prayer circle. I'm all right. Mrs. Laverne placed another stack of napkins down. All right is a suitcase word. Holds more than folks think. Annie smiled despite herself. Yes, ma'am. After breakfast, Ruth joined the choir upstairs, and Annie sat alone at the end of a long table with the old book open in front of her. She was not reading so much as searching. Since the article, since the BU office, since the whispers, Jonathan's words had started to feel less like comfort and more like evidence. If this book had helped her mother keep faith, Annie wanted to know why. She turned page after page, looking for the underlines Ruth had left years earlier. Near the middle, she found a folded slip of paper tucked deep into the spine. At first, she thought it was a receipt. The paper was thin and soft, yellowed at the creases. Annie unfolded it carefully. Her mother's handwriting covered both sides in pencil. Lighter now, but still clear. Annie, if you are reading this one day, It means you found the book I kept closest when life tried to make me feel small. Annie stopped breathing for a moment. She looked toward the stairs, half expecting Ruth to appear. Music drifted faintly from the sanctuary above, a piano warming through a hymn. Around her, volunteers scraped plates and laughed near the kitchen, but the table seemed to narrow until only the letter existed. She read on, "I bought this book when I was carrying you. I was tired, broke, and scared. I had just been told by a woman at the clinic that girls like me should be realistic. She did not say black. She did not say poor. She did not have to. I walked out with my head down and found this book in a bin outside a used bookstore for $1. I read the first chapter on the bus. By the time I got home, I had decided my child would not inherit my lowered eyes." Annie pressed her fingers against the paper. She had known pieces of Ruth's life, but not this. Ruth was careful with pain. She wrapped it in jokes, in church sayings, in instructions about laundry and bus schedules. She rarely handed it over plainly. The letter continued, "There will be people who confuse your need with weakness. Let them be wrong. There will be rooms where people look at you and see a favor instead of a mind. Let them learn. If I cannot give you every dollar, I pray I have given you enough backbone to stand in any room and know you belong there." Annie blinked hard. The words blurred, then sharpened again. "I marked a sentence in this book because I needed to believe it for both of us. Opportunity is not charity. Remember that, Annie. If help ever comes to you, test it. Make sure it does not ask for your silence. Make sure it does not make you smaller. But if the help is clean, if it leaves your name and your dignity intact, do not reject it just because pride is louder than wisdom." A chair scraped across the floor beside her. Annie folded the letter quickly, but not before Mrs. Laverne saw her face. The older woman sat down without asking. "That from your mama?" Annie nodded. She always did write better than she talked when it came to feelings. "You knew about it?" "I knew she kept something in that book, didn't know what." Mrs. Laverne leaned back. "Ruth was pregnant with you when she bought it. Carried that thing like medicine." Annie looked at the folded paper. "Why didn't she tell me? Maybe she wanted you to find it when you needed it, not when she was ready." Annie let that sit. From upstairs, the choir began to sing for real now, voices rising through the floorboards. Mrs. Laverne touched the table with 2 fingers. "Your mama fought quiet battles, baby. Don't mistake quiet for easy." "I don't. I know. But sometimes children see the sacrifice and miss the loneliness." That sentence hurt because it was true in a way Annie had not expected. She had seen Ruth's work shoes, the envelopes, the late shifts. She had not imagined Ruth on a bus years ago, pregnant and frightened, reading a stranger's book to keep from surrendering hope. After service, Annie waited until they were home. Ruth was hanging her church coat in the closet when Annie placed the folded letter on the kitchen table. Ruth froze. "I found it," Annie said. Ruth turned slowly. "In the book?" Annie nodded. For a while, neither moved. Then Ruth came to the table and sat down. She did not pick up the letter. "I forgot I left it there," she said, though her voice made clear she had not forgotten. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ruth rubbed her hands together, the way she did when they hurt. "Because some stories are hard to tell your child while you're still trying to look strong in front of her. You don't have to look strong all the time." Ruth smiled sadly. "That's something daughters say after they've grown enough to scare their mothers." Annie sat across from her. "You were scared when you had me?" "Terrified." Ruth let out a breath. "I was 22, working at a diner, sharing a room with your aunt, and tired of hearing what people thought my life was going to be. Then I found out I was carrying you. Folks gave advice like they were handing out weather reports. Be realistic, don't expect too much, take what you can get." "That woman at the clinic said that?" "Something close." Ruth looked at the book. "Your Mr. Reed's words came to me on a day I needed someone to say the opposite. He's not my Mr. Reed." "I know." Ruth's mouth curved a little. "But that book was ours, before he walked back into it." Annie lowered her eyes to the letter. "You wrote that if help comes, I should test it. And you did. I still don't know if I trust him. You don't have to decide all of him right now. Decide the part in front of you." Annie thought of Jonathan's public statement, the way he had refused to name her. She thought of the independent review, the board, the email that made Ruth cry in the kitchen. She thought of his face when he saw his own book in her hands. "He's trying," she said. Ruth nodded. "Trying matters. So does what made the trying necessary." That evening, Annie emailed Jonathan. Not a thank you note, not forgiveness, Just a message. I found something my mother wrote in your book years ago. I think you should know your words reached people long before your money did. She hesitated, then added a photo of one paragraph from Ruth's letter, the line about opportunity not being charity. She asked Ruth's permission first. Ruth said yes, then pretended to be busy at the sink while Annie sent it. Jonathan received the email at his office after a long meeting about the fund's expansion. He opened the attachment and read Ruth's handwriting. Once, then again. The words did something the article, the scandal, and even his own book had not done. They made the consequences of his younger self real. Not public, not framed, real. Claire found him standing by the window with the phone in his hand. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. "Maybe I saw proof I used to be alive." She waited. He handed her the phone. Claire read the paragraph and did not speak for a long time. "Jonathan," she said finally, "this is what a legacy is. Not buildings, not headlines. Someone reading your words on a bus and standing up straighter." He looked at the city below, "And I almost crushed her daughter on a sidewalk." "Yes," Claire said, "because she respected him too much to lie. You did." He accepted it. The shame no longer felt like something to escape. It felt like something to obey. What do I say back? The truth, and not too much of it. Jonathan sat at his desk and typed slowly. "Annie, thank you for trusting me with this. Your mother's words humbled me. I cannot claim credit for her strength, but I am grateful something I wrote kept her company when she needed it. I am still sorry for what I did on that sidewalk. I will let the work speak from here." He sent it before he could make it prettier. Across town, Annie read the reply at the kitchen table, while Ruth ladled rice and beans into bowls. She did not smile exactly, but her face eased. "What did he say?" Ruth asked. Annie read it aloud. Ruth listened, then nodded once. "That'll do for now." Later, after Ruth went to bed, Annie opened the old book again and placed the letter back where she had found it. Not to hide it, but to keep it with the pages that had carried it all those years. Then she turned to a blank page near the back and wrote one sentence in pencil. "A chance is not the same as mercy. A chance is what justice looks like when it finally arrives." She closed the book and rested her hand on the cover. For the first time since the sidewalk, the book did not feel like a wound or a debt. It felt like a bridge, built by a young man who had forgotten, preserved by a mother who had not, and now held by a daughter trying to cross without bowing her head. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon, printed on heavy cream paper with the university seal at the top and Annie's name centered in black ink. Ruth found it first, tucked halfway through the mail slot with a grocery flyer and an electric bill. She called Annie into the kitchen with the careful voice she used when news might go either way. "What is it?" Annie asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Ruth held up the envelope. "Boston University." Annie opened it slowly. The letter inside invited her to speak at a small admitted students gathering for first-generation and scholarship recipients. Not a keynote, not a big stage, just a panel in a campus hall with counselors, parents, and incoming students who were still deciding whether they could afford to say yes. Annie read the last line twice. "We would be honored if you would share your perspective on access, dignity, and the transition into college." Ruth leaned over her shoulder. "They want you to talk. They want the scholarship girl to talk." "No," Ruth said, taking the letter and tapping the words with one finger. "They want Annie Carter to talk. Don't hand them a smaller name for yourself." Annie sat down. "I don't know. You spoke up in that aid session. That was different. I was angry. Anger can open your mouth. It can't write the whole speech." Annie looked at her mother. "What would I even say? The truth. But make it yours before anybody else tries to make it theirs." That night, Annie sat at the kitchen table with a chance for the forgotten open beside her mother's letter. The apartment was quiet except for the radiator and Ruth's soft footsteps in the bedroom. Annie had a blank document on the laptop and 3 sentences she hated. Everything sounded either too polished or too wounded. She did not want to perform pain. She did not want to pretend it had not shaped her. She deleted the opening again and stared at the cursor. After a while, Ruth came in wearing her robe and carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Still fighting it? It keeps sounding like I'm begging people to understand." "Then stop begging." Annie rubbed her eyes. "Easy to say." Ruth sat across from her. "Start with the sidewalk. I'm tired of the sidewalk." "I know, but maybe the sidewalk is tired of being told wrong." Annie looked at the old blue book. The cover had dried from the snow, but a faint watermark remained near the corner. She touched it with 2 fingers, then began typing. "I sold books on a sidewalk because I was short on tuition. not short on ambition. She paused. That was closer. By the morning of the event, Annie had written 5 pages and cut them to 2. She wore a navy dress Ruth had found on sale, a black cardigan, and the earrings her grandmother had left behind. Ruth pressed the dress twice, even though it did not need pressing. Then she stood behind Annie in the bathroom mirror and smoothed her hair. "You don't have to be perfect," Ruth said. "I know. You only have to be clear." "That's worse." Ruth laughed softly. Usually, the campus hall was smaller than Annie expected, with rows of chairs, a coffee table at the back, and a banner that read, "First Generation Welcome Evening." Parents stood with folded programs. Students hovered near the walls, trying to look casual while holding folders full of fear. Annie recognized that look. She had worn it to every office where money was discussed in numbers too large to feel real. Marcus from the aid session waved from the 3rd row. "You got this," he said when she passed. "I haven't done anything yet." Still true. At the front of the room sat 2 counselors, a professor, and 1 empty chair with Annie's name taped to it. She sat down and placed the old blue book in her lap. She had not planned to bring it out, but leaving it at home felt wrong. The panel began with safe questions. Where are you from? What are you excited about? What worries you most? Annie answered carefully at first. Roxbury. Education policy, money, belonging, and being mistaken for someone who should feel lucky just to be present. A few parents shifted when she said that. A few students looked up. Then the moderator, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Alvarez, turned to her. "Annie, many students here are balancing pride, need, and uncertainty. What would you want them to know?" Annie looked at the paper in her hand. Then she folded it once and set it on her lap. "I'd want them to know that needing help doesn't mean you didn't work hard enough," she said. "That's something I had to learn the hard way. When you grow up in a family where every dollar has a job before it arrives, you start thinking every shortfall is a personal failure. It isn't. Sometimes the math is unfair before you even touch it." The room quieted. She continued, her voice steadier now. "I sold books because my mother and I did everything we knew how to do, and there was still a gap. People like to talk about opportunity like it's a door, but for some families, the door has 3 locks, a fee, and someone standing beside it asking whether you really belong inside." A father in the 2nd row nodded slowly. Annie placed one hand on the old book. "My mother kept a book for years because it reminded her that opportunity is not charity. I believe that. A scholarship should not make a student feel purchased. It should make a student free to do the work they already earned the right to do." At the back of the room, a woman wiped her eyes with the corner of a program. Annie saw a boy in a worn blazer sit up straighter. She saw Marcus grin at the floor. "I'm grateful for the help I received," Annie said, "but gratitude should never require silence. If you are here tonight, and you are scared about money, or forms, or whether people will look at you like you are an exception instead of a student, I want you to know this. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to need support. You are allowed to belong without apologizing for the road you took to get here." She stopped before her voice could shake. The silence held for one breath. Then applause rose from the students first. Not loud at the beginning, but firm. Parents joined. The counselors. Marcus stood, and a few others followed. Annie stayed seated because her knees did not feel reliable. After the panel, people came up in small groups. A mother from Dorchester asked about payment plans. A student from Lowell said he had been embarrassed to talk about work study until tonight. An older father with rough hands shook Annie's hand with both of his and said, "My girl needed to hear that. Maybe I did too." Annie thanked each of them. Not with speeches, just eye contact and plain words. Near the end, Dr. Alvarez approached. "You reached them." Annie let out a breath. "I was afraid I'd sound angry." "You did sound angry at times," Dr. Alvarez said. "Appropriately. Anger with direction is not a flaw." Marcus came over as Dr. Alvarez left. "So, when are you running for office?" "Never. That's what they all say." Annie laughed. It felt good, easier than it had in weeks. When she stepped outside, the evening air was cold but dry. Ruth waited near the entrance in her work coat, holding 2 coffees from a cart down the block. She had slipped into the back of the room after her shift, still smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and cafeteria rolls. "You heard?" Annie asked. "Every word." "And?" Ruth handed her a coffee. "You sounded like yourself." Annie looked down, blinking fast. "That's all I wanted." "I know. They walked slowly toward the train. Students passed them in clusters, laughing, arguing about dinner, calling parents, complaining about homework they did not yet have. Annie listened and felt something new settle beside her fear. Not certainty, not ease, but a small claim. At the station, Ruth nudged her. "You should tell Mr. Reed." Annie frowned. "Why?" "Because the work spoke. He said he'd let it." Annie thought about that while the train approached. By the time they got home, she sent Jonathan a short message. "I spoke at BU tonight. I used one line from my mother's note and one from the book. People listened." His reply came 15 minutes later. "I'm glad they listened. More importantly, I'm glad you spoke." Annie read it twice, then placed the phone face down. She did not need more from him that night. Across town, Jonathan sat in his office with the message still open. He did not forward it to Claire. He did not turn it into a quote for the foundation. He simply sat with it. On his desk, the first draft of the permanent fund announcement waited for approval. The communications team had written a clean paragraph about empowering underserved scholars. Jonathan picked up a pen and crossed the phrase out. In the margin, he wrote, "Say students, say families, say costs. Stop polishing the wound." The next morning, Claire read the edit and looked at him over her glasses. "That sounds like Annie got through to you again. She seems to do that without trying. Good. Try not to make it her job." "I won't." Claire set the paper down. "The board wants you to speak at the launch next week." Jonathan nodded. "I know. They'll expect the old version of you. Then they'll be disappointed. Some of them won't like it." Jonathan looked at the old book resting by his lamp. "I'm done being liked for the wrong things." Claire's expression softened, but she kept her tone dry. "Careful." That almost sounded like growth. He smiled faintly. "Don't put that in the press release." That evening, Annie returned from work to find Ruth at the kitchen table with the old letter and a fresh envelope. Ruth had copied the letter by hand onto clean paper. "What's that?" Annie asked. "The original stays in the book," Ruth said. "This copy goes with you when you start school." Annie sat down slowly. Ruth slid the envelope across the table. "Not because you need reminding every day, because on some days, rooms get loud." Annie picked up the envelope. Her name was written across the front in Ruth's careful script. "Thank you," she said. Ruth reached over and squeezed her hand. "Keep your head up, baby." Annie looked at the book, the letter, the laptop still open from her speech, and the university envelope pinned to the refrigerator. For most of her life, the future had felt like something she had to chase before it disappeared. Now it still felt hard, still expensive, still uncertain, but it no longer felt imaginary. The sidewalk had not been the end of her dignity. It had become the place where she learned how much of it she was willing to defend. The launch for the Forgotten Chance Fund was scheduled for Thursday evening in a ballroom on the second floor of a downtown hotel, the kind of room Jonathan knew too well. High ceiling, white tablecloths, water glasses lined like small soldiers, donors with practiced smiles, and a podium placed under lights bright enough to make sincerity look rehearsed. Years ago, he would have walked into that room with a speech already memorized, a joke ready, and a sentence about giving back polished until it shone. Now he stood in a service hallway behind the ballroom. Holding 3 pages he no longer wanted to read, Claire stood beside him, arms folded, watching a staff member test the microphone through the open door. "You can still use the approved remarks," she said. Jonathan looked at the pages. "They're safe." "Yes. That's the problem." Claire did not argue. She had seen him cross out half the speech that morning and rewrite the margins by hand. "The board will expect numbers." "They'll get numbers. They'll expect gratitude." "From whom?" She looked at him then. He nodded once. "Exactly." Inside the ballroom, people were taking their seats. Foundation board members, university officers, several donors, 2 retired educators, a city councilwoman, and a few reporters who had been told the event was about the fund, not Annie. Jonathan had insisted on that. No recipient photos, no personal stories without permission, no young person turned into proof of his compassion. Still, the old world had its habits. As he stepped toward the ballroom entrance, he heard a man near the registration table say, "This whole thing started with that girl selling books. Right? Brilliant public relations recovery after the Whitmore embarrassment." Jonathan stopped. The man speaking was Charles Benton, a board member with silver cufflinks and a talent for smiling while saying ugly things. Another man beside him chuckled. "Reed always lands on his feet," Benton continued. Even a scandal becomes a scholarship. Jonathan felt Claire's eyes on him. He could have walked past. He had done that sort of thing for years, filing away insults as the price of doing business. But Annie's voice returned to him. That depends on what you do when nobody's watching. He turned. Charles. Benton's smile widened before he realized Jonathan had heard him. Jonathan. Big night. It is. I was just saying the fund has drawn excellent attention. No, Jonathan said calmly. You were saying a student's hardship made good public relations. The air around them changed. The second man looked down at his program. Benton gave a small laugh. Come on, you know how these things work. I do. That's why it needs to stop. The smile left Benton's face. This is hardly the place. This is exactly the place. Jonathan kept his voice low, but not private. The fund exists for students, not for cleaning up my reputation and not for giving donors a warm story to repeat over dinner. If that disappoints anyone, they should not give. Benton's jaw tightened. Careful, Jonathan. Moral speeches get expensive. So does moral cowardice. I've been paying for that one all week. Claire looked away, but Jonathan could tell she was close to smiling. Benton said nothing else. Jonathan entered the ballroom without waiting for him. The program began with polite introductions. A dean spoke about access. A city councilwoman spoke about Boston's future. Dr. Hayes, the retired principal from Dorchester, spoke plainly about students he had watched lose scholarships because they could not cover the final fees. Housing deposits, lab costs, meal plans, the small expenses that became walls. People listened more closely to him than they had listened to anyone else. Then Claire walked to the podium. Mr. Reed will now offer remarks. Jonathan stood. Applause rose, full and familiar. He hated how easily part of him still recognized it as food. He walked to the podium, placed the approved speech down, and looked at the room. Thank you for being here, he began. The Forgotten Chance Fund will support 50 students in its first year. The selection process will be independent. The criteria will be public. The students will not be used in promotional materials without their consent. That last point should not be unusual, but in rooms like this, it often is. A few people shifted in their chairs. Jonathan looked at the first row, then beyond it. Most of you know some version of the story behind this fund. A student selling used books, a tuition gap, a public conversation that became louder than it should have. What many of you do not know is that I did not come to this work because I was noble. The room quieted. I came to it because I was cruel. Claire stood still near the wall. Jonathan continued, I saw a young woman selling books on a sidewalk, and I treated her with contempt. I assumed things I had no right to assume. I mocked what she was doing. Worse than that, I interfered with it. People stopped to buy from her, and I discouraged them. I took money from her pocket with my arrogance, and I called it judgment. No one moved now. He glanced down at the old blue book on the podium. He had brought his own copy, unframed and worn from the week of reading. Then a book fell from her stack. It was one I wrote when I was young and poor enough to remember what locked doors felt like. In that book, I wrote that opportunity is not charity. I wrote that children should not be punished for being born without privilege. I wrote those words. And then, years later, stood in the snow punishing someone for needing the opportunity I once begged for. The microphone carried each word clearly. Somewhere near the back, a reporter lowered his pen as if listening had become more important than recording. I could tell you this fund is about generosity. That would be easier. It would also be dishonest. This fund is about repair. Not enough repair. Not complete repair. But a beginning. It is about admitting that talent is everywhere while access is not. It is about understanding that a student should not have to turn private pain into public theater to receive help. And it is about remembering that dignity does not increase when wealthy people notice it. It was there already. He looked toward Charles Benton's table. So tonight, I am not asking you to applaud me. I am asking you to fund a structure that does not depend on me being moved by one story on one winter night. Emotion fades. Systems remain. Let's build one that opens doors without asking students to bow first. For a second after he finished, the room stayed silent. Then Dr. Hayes stood and clapped once, firmly. Reverend Walker stood next. Karen Lou followed. The applause spread, less smooth than before, more serious. Jonathan stepped away from the podium before it could become too comfortable. Claire met him near the side wall. That was not the approved speech. No, it was better. He exhaled. Some people hated it. Good speeches usually leave the right people uncomfortable. Across town, Annie was not in the ballroom. She had chosen not to go. The invitation had come through the foundation, polite and careful, with no pressure to attend. She had read it twice, then declined. Ruth had supported the decision. "You don't owe them your face," Ruth said. So Annie worked her shift at Henderson's, came home, ate leftover rice and beans, and only later watched a recording someone had posted from the event. Ruth stood behind her chair, one hand resting on Annie's shoulder. The video quality was poor, but Jonathan's voice was clear. "I came to it because I was cruel." Annie sat very still. Ruth murmured, "Well." They watched the rest without speaking. When Jonathan said dignity does not increase when wealthy people notice it, Ruth squeezed Annie's shoulder once. After the video ended, Annie closed the laptop. The kitchen light hummed above them. "What are you thinking?" Ruth asked. Annie leaned back. He told the truth. "Yes. In public. Yes. That doesn't erase what happened." "No. But it matters." Ruth pulled out the chair beside her and sat. "That's the hard part about people. They can be wrong and then do something right. Makes it harder to keep them in the box where you put them." Annie gave a faint smile. "You always have to make things complicated." "That's because they are." Annie looked at the old book on the table. "Do you think people can really change?" Ruth thought before answering. "Some can. If the truth costs them something, and they still choose it." The next morning, the articles were different. Not all kind, not all fair, but different. One headline read, "Reed admits cruelty in launch of Student Access Fund." Another asked whether philanthropy could repair systems it helped create. A columnist criticized him for public confession, calling it moral performance. Annie read that one twice and then closed it. Maybe it was performance. Maybe everything became performance once cameras entered. But she had seen him on the sidewalk before cameras mattered. She had seen the first crack at Reed Global. The backlash arrived before lunch. 2 donors threatened to withdraw. 1 board member resigned, though Claire noted he had missed every meeting for 6 months anyway. Charles Benton requested a private conversation and used the word reckless 3 times in 4 minutes. Jonathan listened from behind his desk. When Benton finished, Jonathan asked, "Are you withdrawing from the fund?" Benton stiffened. "I didn't say that." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't need to humiliate yourself to help people." Jonathan looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't humiliate myself by telling the truth. I humiliated myself on the sidewalk." Benton had no answer for that. By evening, after the calls slowed, Claire stepped into Jonathan's office and set a stack of envelopes on his desk. First, donor checks after the speech. "I thought we lost donors." "We did. We gained others." She tapped the envelopes. Smaller checks, retired teachers, church groups, a veterans association, 2 parents whose children almost left school over fees. Jonathan picked up one envelope. The return address was from a woman in Quincy. Inside was a check for $25 and a note written in blue ink. "My son needed a GAP grant in 1987. Somebody helped him. Please help someone else." Jonathan read it twice. Claire watched him. "This is the kind of money that comes with memory attached." He placed the note beside the old book. "Then it deserves more respect than the large checks." "It deserves the same respect," Claire corrected. He nodded. "You're right." That night, Annie received an email from the foundation. Not a press release, not a request. It was a forwarded note from Karen Liu. Sent to all recipients. The fund is now permanent. Your award remains private unless you choose otherwise. No action required. Annie read the line, "No action required," and felt something unclench. So much of being helped had felt like waiting for the hidden demand. Smile, speak, pose, thank the right person, prove pain worthy of investment. But here, at least for now, there was no demand. She opened a new document on her laptop. At the top she typed, "Questions for Financial Aid Office." Then, "Books to buy used." Then, "Work schedule after classes start." Ordinary lists. Student lists. The kind of lists she had wanted the right to make. Ruth came in with a basket of folded laundry. "You working on school things?" "Yes." "Good." Annie looked up. "Mom? I think I want to study education policy first, then maybe law." Ruth set the basket down. "That sounds like a long road." "I know, You ready for long? Annie thought about the sidewalk, the article, the room at BU, Jonathan at the podium telling the truth while people with money shifted in their chairs. Not always. Ruth smiled. That's honest. But I'm going anyway. Ruth came over and kissed her forehead. That's my girl. Outside, the city moved under a cold sky. Somewhere downtown, donors argued about image and impact. Somewhere in an office tower, Jonathan Reed was learning that repair had to survive discomfort. And in a small kitchen in Roxbury, Annie Carter made her lists like a student preparing for the future, not a symbol waiting to be used. For the first time, the next step did not feel like escape. It felt like entrance. The week after the launch, Jonathan received more praise than he wanted, and more criticism than he could dismiss. Both irritated him for different reasons. Praise tempted the old appetite. Criticism tempted the old defensiveness. Claire noticed and gave him work instead of comfort. Read these, she said, dropping a stack of student letters on his desk. I thought I wasn't supposed to influence selection. You're not. These are general inquiries. Students asking how to apply next year. Families asking if the fund covers housing deposits. Veterans asking whether their grandchildren qualify. No private files. Just the public asking whether the door is real. Jonathan looked at the stack. How many? 214 since Thursday. He leaned back. That fast? That's what happens when you say something true in a room built for polite lies. He picked up the first letter. A mother in Lowell wrote that her son had been admitted to college but could not afford the first payment on a meal plan. A grandfather in Fall River asked whether part-time students counted. A guidance counselor from Springfield sent a list of questions because, she wrote, my students stop dreaming when the spreadsheet starts. Jonathan read for an hour. Then two. By the time he finished the first stack, he understood what Claire had known from the beginning. Annie had never been an exception. She had been visible. At noon, his communications director, Paul, entered with a revised announcement for the permanent fund. Paul was young, polished, and fond of words like impactful and transformative. Jonathan had hired him years ago because he knew how to make generosity sound marketable. We cleaned up the language, Paul said, sliding the draft across the desk. Stronger message, better donor appeal. We added a student-centered tagline. Jonathan read the first paragraph. The Forgotten Chance Fund, founded by billionaire education leader Jonathan Reed, after a life-changing encounter with a struggling student, will empower underserved youth to overcome adversity and pursue their dreams. He set the paper down. No, Paul blinked. No? This is exactly what I said not to do. It's standard nonprofit language. That's not a defense. Paul glanced at Claire, who had taken the chair by the window and was pretending not to enjoy herself. Jonathan crossed out the first sentence. Do not call them underserved youth like we're discussing a market segment. Do not put me before the students. Do not turn struggle into decoration. Say what the fund does. Paul took out a pen. All right, what do you want? Jonathan thought of Annie's lists at the kitchen table, though he had never seen them. He thought of the letters in front of him. Write this. The Forgotten Chance Fund helps admitted students cover final college costs that remain after aid, savings, and work. The fund is independently reviewed. Recipients are students, not publicity stories. Paul hesitated. That's less emotional. It's more respectful. Claire added from the window. Respect is allowed to be plain. Paul nodded slowly. Understood. After he left, Claire stood. You handled that better than expected. I'm glad your expectations are low. They're realistic. She picked up one of the letters. There's something else. Boston University asked whether you'll attend the scholarship reception next month. Is Annie attending? They didn't say. Then my answer shouldn't depend on that. Claire smiled faintly. Good. That evening, Annie sat in a student orientation room with 20 other incoming students, most of them first generation, all of them carrying some version of the same guarded hope. The university had organized a smaller gathering after the panel, this time focused on practical things. How to talk to professors, where to find cheap textbooks, what to do when a bill looked wrong, how not to let embarrassment keep you from asking for help. Annie liked this room better than the last. Less performance, more useful. Marcus sat beside her, spinning a pen between his fingers. You buying books new or used? Used. Always. Good. New textbooks are a legal scam. Maybe I'll sue someday. I'll testify. A counselor at the front asked everyone to share one concern about starting college. Students mentioned money, transportation, Imposter syndrome. Family expectations. Working too many hours. Annie listened and realized that fear sounded different from person to person, but it often sat in the same place. The chest, where breathing should be easy. When it was her turn, she said, "I'm worried people will remember the article before they learn my name." The room went quiet, but not in the sharp way she feared. Several students nodded. A girl across the circle said, "My high school called me the homeless scholarship kid. After my family stayed in a shelter. Teachers thought they were being supportive." A young man near the door added, "People love a sad story as long as it ends with them feeling good." Annie looked at him. "Exactly." The counselor let the silence sit, then said, "Then maybe one rule for this room is that nobody owes us their pain as an introduction." That stayed with Annie. She wrote it in her notebook, then underlined it. After the session, a university staff member handed her a sealed envelope. This came through the financial aid office. "It's from the foundation, but not a public notice." Annie waited until she was outside to open it. Inside was a short letter from the Forgotten Chance Fund, confirming payment to the university, followed by a second page. Not from Jonathan. From the 3 reviewers. "Dear Miss Carter, we selected your application because your record, need, and essay met the purpose of this award. We want to state plainly that you did not receive this scholarship as a favor. You received it because you qualified. We hope this letter is useful on any day when others misunderstand the difference." It was signed by Reverend Denise Walker, Dr. Milton Hayes, and Karen Liu. Annie read it twice on the sidewalk, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the old blue book. This was the kind of proof she had not known she needed. Not proof for strangers, proof for the quiet days when doubt-spoken voices borrowed from other people. At home, Ruth read the letter at the kitchen table and nodded, as if the reviewers had passed a test. "They said it right," Ruth said. "They did. You should frame that." Annie laughed. "Like Jonathan framed his book?" Ruth pointed a fork at her. "Don't get smart. I said frame the letter, not your ego." Annie smiled and took it back. "I'll keep it in the book." "That's better." A few days later, Annie received a message from Jonathan. "The fund is revising its public language. Claire suggested I ask whether you would be willing to read one paragraph. Not as a spokesperson, just as someone who has the right to reject bad wording. No pressure. No public connection." Annie stared at the message. She did not answer right away. Part of her wanted to refuse on principle. Another part remembered the headline that had made her feel reduced to a symbol. Words mattered. Bad words could take a person's life and bend it into something convenient. She replied, "Send it." The paragraph arrived 5 minutes later. It was plain, almost too plain. The Forgotten Chance Fund supports admitted students whose remaining college costs create a barrier to enrollment. Awards are reviewed independently. Students are not required to share personal stories publicly. The fund exists to reduce financial barriers, not to define the students who receive support. Annie read it twice. She typed, "Better. Change, receive support," to use the award. Receiving sounds passive. Using sounds like they're going somewhere. Jonathan replied, "Done. Thank you." She almost put the phone down, then added, "Also remove barrier the second time. You already said it once." A minute later, Claire says you're hired. Annie smiled despite herself. Ruth looked up from sorting laundry. "What?" "Nothing. That didn't look like nothing. I edited a Billionaire's paragraph." Ruth returned to folding a towel. "Good. Somebody needed to." The first scholarship reception took place 3 weeks later in a university hall, not a hotel ballroom. No reporters were allowed inside. Families came in winter coats, students in borrowed blazers or dresses bought on sale, grandparents with cameras, younger siblings told not to touch the dessert table. Jonathan attended, but he did not speak first. Reverend Walker did. She stood at the podium and looked over the room with the steady gaze of someone used to telling hard truths kindly. "Tonight is not about rescue," she said. "It is about recognition. These students have already done work. This award removes one obstacle. It does not create their worth." Annie sat beside Ruth near the middle. She felt Ruth's hand find hers under the table. When the students' names were called, each received a folder, a handshake, and applause. No one was asked to tell a sad story. No one's hardship was summarized from a podium. When Annie's name came, she stood, walked forward, and shook Karen Liu's hand first. Then Dr. Hayes's. Then Reverend Walker's. Jonathan stood at the end of the line. For a second, the whole story seemed to narrow to the space between them. He held out his hand. "Congratulations, Miss Carter." She took it. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." No apology, no speech, no public moment larger than it needed to be. But as she started to step away, he said quietly, only for her, "Your edit made the paragraph better." Annie looked back. It was a low bar. He laughed once, surprised and genuine. "Fair." She returned to her seat, and Ruth leaned close. "You all right?" "Yes," Annie said, and she was. Not because everything was healed. Not because the sidewalk had vanished. It had not. But the room had not asked her to shrink. That was new. Later, while families ate cookies and took pictures, Jonathan stood near the back with Claire. He watched Annie speaking with Marcus and 2 other students. She was laughing, one hand wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, the old blue book tucked in her tote bag. She looked like a student at a reception, not a lesson. Claire followed his gaze. "Careful. I know." "What do you know?" "That her life is hers." Claire nodded. "Good." Jonathan looked at the room. Parents comparing financial aid notes. Students exchanging phone numbers. A grandmother wiping her eyes when her grandson wasn't looking. None of it felt like charity. It felt like doors being unlocked quietly. Annie crossed the room a few minutes later with Ruth. They stopped near Jonathan and Claire on their way out. Ruth offered her hand first. "Mr. Reed." Jonathan shook it with both respect and caution. "Mrs. Carter, I heard your speech at the launch." "Yes, ma'am. You told the truth." "I tried." Ruth looked at him for a moment, long enough that he stood straighter without meaning to. "Keep doing that when it costs more." "I will." She nodded, accepting the promise but not decorating it. Annie admired that. Ruth could make even a billionaire feel like he had homework. Outside the hall, Annie and Ruth walked toward the train through a cold evening. The campus lights were on, and students moved across the walkways with backpacks, laughter, and complaints about exams. Annie held the folder from the reception under her arm. Inside were documents, contacts, deadlines, and the reviewer's letter she had brought with her for courage. Ruth glanced at her. "How does it feel?" Annie thought before answering. "Like I'm not visiting anymore." Ruth smiled. "Say that again." Annie looked at the buildings ahead, then at the students passing under the lamps. "It feels like I'm not visiting." They walked on, mother and daughter, past the doors Annie would soon enter every day. Behind them, in a university hall without cameras, a fund had begun its work. Ahead of them was the harder work Annie had chosen for herself. This time, no one had to invite her to believe she belonged. She already did. Years passed. Not quickly, though memory would later make them feel that way. Annie began at Boston University with 2 used notebooks, a refurbished laptop, and the old blue book wrapped in a scarf inside her tote bag. She learned which buildings stayed warm late, which professors answered emails like human beings, which dining hall soup could be stretched with crackers when her shift ran long. She worked part-time, studied full-time, called Ruth every night, and kept the reviewer's letter folded inside a chance for the forgotten for the days when doubt tried to sound official. She did not become comfortable all at once. In her first semester, she still hesitated before entering office hours. She still checked her account balance more often than necessary. She still noticed when classmates spoke about unpaid internships like summer weather, easy and expected. But she also learned to raise her hand before fear finished its argument. She learned to ask for the grant, the meeting, the extension, the answer. More than once, she sat across from a younger student in the library and said, "Go to financial aid before the deadline scares you into silence." Jonathan kept his distance, as promised. The Forgotten Chance Fund grew, but it did not put recipients on billboards or turn their lives into donor entertainment. Claire made sure of that. Reverend Walker, Dr. Hayes, and Karen Liu became the spine of the review board, and every year, more letters came from families who had been one unpaid balance away from surrender. Jonathan read the public ones, answered some by hand, and learned to be useful without being seen at the center. Once a year, Annie received a short note from the foundation. Never sentimental, always practical. Renewal forms, application windows, policy updates. At the bottom, sometimes a handwritten line from Claire, "Still editing our words. You trained us well." By her senior year, Annie had chosen law. Not because it sounded impressive, and not because anger alone could carry a person through casebooks, but because she had seen how often dignity depended on paperwork. A wrong form, a missed deadline, a fee hidden in a paragraph, a policy written by people who had never counted quarters at a kitchen table. She wanted to understand the rooms where decisions were made, and then she wanted to change the doors. Ruth watched all of it with pride. She tried to keep modest and failed. She still worked at the school cafeteria, though fewer night shifts now. When Annie graduated, Ruth arrived 2 hours early and saved seats she did not need to save. She wore a blue dress, low heels, and the earrings her own mother had left behind. When Annie crossed the stage, Ruth stood before the announcer finished saying her name. "That's my baby," she said, not softly. Marcus, seated beside her, clapped and laughed. "Yes, ma'am, it is." Jonathan attended too, at the back, by invitation. He did not approach until after the crowds thinned. Annie saw him standing near the edge of the lawn, older now in small ways, thinner at the face, less armored. Claire stood beside him with a cane she insisted was temporary. "You came," Annie said. Jonathan smiled. "I was invited. That didn't always stop you from showing up where you weren't wanted." "No," he said. "It didn't." The honesty between them no longer felt like a weapon. It had become part of the language they used. Ruth joined them, carrying flowers and a program already bent at the corners. "Mr. Reed, Mrs. Carter," he turned to Annie. "Congratulations, Miss Carter. Thank you." She held her diploma folder against her side. "Law school next." "I heard." "From who?" He glanced at Claire. Claire lifted one hand. "I hear things." Annie laughed. "Of course you do." Jonathan grew serious. "You earned this." "I know," Annie said. He looked glad she did. Law school was harder, colder, and less forgiving. Annie spent nights reading cases until the words blurred. She studied housing law, education law, civil rights law. She interned with a legal aid office where the waiting room filled before the doors opened. Mothers came with eviction notices, students came with suspension letters, grandparents came with benefits forms they could not decode. Annie saw, again and again, that injustice was not always loud. Sometimes it was a form mailed to the wrong address. Sometimes it was a counselor assuming a child had no ambition because his shoes were worn. Sometimes it was a tuition hold that kept a student from registering while the university praised diversity on its website. After graduation, she did not join a large firm, though one made an offer that would have changed Ruth's life overnight. Instead, Annie became an education rights attorney in Boston. She helped students appeal wrongful aid decisions, fought discriminatory discipline policies, and worked with families who had been told to be patient by people whose children never had to wait. The first case she won on her own involved a boy denied enrollment after moving between shelters. His grandmother cried in the courthouse hallway, gripping Annie's hands. "They made me feel like I was asking for extra," the woman said. Annie shook her head. "You were asking for what he was owed." That evening, she went home to Ruth's apartment, the same kitchen table, though now with better chairs Annie had bought after her first paycheck. Ruth made meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans because celebration, in her view, required food that held the plate down. "You look tired," Ruth said. "I am tired." "Good tired?" Annie thought about the boy's face when he learned he could go to school Monday. "Yes, good tired." A month later, on a cold December evening, Annie returned to Boylston Street, not for an event, not for memory exactly. She had finished work late and decided to walk instead of taking the train from the closest stop. Copley Square was lit for Christmas again. The library glowed behind bare trees. People moved past with cups of coffee, shopping bags, and children wrapped against the wind. A trumpet player stood near the corner. Not the same man from years ago, but close enough that the first note made Annie stop. She turned toward the stretch of sidewalk where she had once laid out her books. The place looked ordinary. That almost hurt. No marker. No sign. No evidence that a young woman had stood there with $11 and a future still out of reach. The city did not remember for you. You had to choose what to carry. Annie reached into her tote bag and touched the old blue book. She still kept it with her on hard days. The cover was more worn now, the spine repaired with clear tape. Ruth's letter still folded inside, the reviewer's note behind it, and Annie's own pencil sentence near the back. A chance is not the same as mercy. A chance is what justice looks like when it finally arrives. "Excuse me, miss?" The voice came from a few feet away. Annie turned. A boy stood beside a milk crate of used books near the lamppost. He could not have been more than 16, thin, with a knit hat pulled low and a backpack resting against his leg. His sign was written on notebook paper and taped to the crate. Books for sale, saving for school supplies. People passed him the way people pass what makes them uncomfortable, quickly, with small adjustments of the eyes. Annie looked at the books. A math workbook, a mystery novel, 2 children's books, a dictionary with a cracked spine. The boy straightened. "You looking for something?" She felt the years fold quietly between one breath and the next. "How much for this one?" Annie asked, picking up the dictionary. $2, he said. Then, as if expecting rejection, added, "It's old, but it's still good." Annie smiled, but not too much. She remembered how pity felt. Old dictionaries know more words than new people sometimes. He looked surprised, then laughed. "My grandmother says stuff like that. Smart woman. She is." Annie took out $2, then paused. "Do you have change for a 20 if I buy a few more?" His eyes widened. "You want more than one?" "I read a lot." As he counted the books, a woman slowed nearby and looked over the crate. The boy froze, uncertain. Annie stepped aside. Not between him and the customer, but beside him, making room. The woman picked up one of the children's books. "How much, young man?" $3, ma'am, he said, voice stronger now. She bought it. Then a man in a wool coat stopped for the mystery novel. Then a college student bought the workbook. Annie stayed only long enough to see the boy's shoebox fill beyond what he had expected. She did not speak for him. She did not tell his story. She bought books, smiled when he made a sale, and let him stand in the center of his own effort. After a while, he looked at her. "Thanks for stopping." Annie slid the dictionary into her tote. "Someone once stopped for me. Did it help?" She thought of Jonathan's cruelty, his apology, Ruth's letter, the fund, the rooms she had entered, the cases she had won. She thought of how help could be messy and still matter if truth stayed with it. "Yes," she said, "but I had to decide what to do with the chance." The boy nodded as if that made sense, though maybe it would mean more later. Annie started to leave, then turned back. "What's your name?" "Caleb. I'm Annie. Nice to meet you." "You too, Caleb. Keep your money close and your head up." He grinned. "My grandmother says that too." Then listened to her. Annie walked toward the square with the books under her arm. Near the library steps, she saw Jonathan standing by the Christmas tree. Older still, hands in his coat pockets. Claire was not with him. He had a cane now, simple black, held more for balance than pride. He saw her and lifted a hand. "I wondered if you'd come back here someday," he said when she reached him. "I didn't plan to. Neither did I the first time." They stood side by side, watching Caleb sell another book. Jonathan followed her gaze. "You helped him. I bought from him. You stayed. So did you once." He looked at her. "Not kindly at first." "No," Annie said. "Not kindly." The answer did not wound him the way it once might have. Truth had become less frightening with practice. "I think about that night more than you know," he said. "So do I. I used to wish I could erase it." Annie watched Caleb laugh with a customer. "I don't." Jonathan turned slightly. "If you erased it," she said, "you might erase everything that came after. I don't need it erased. I need it remembered correctly." He nodded. "That seems fair." "It is fair." They stood in comfortable silence. Snow began to fall, light and sparse, touching coats, hair, the tops of books, the shoulders of strangers. Across the square, children ran near the lights. A grandfather bent to fix a scarf. A woman took a picture of her family. The city looked almost gentle, though Annie knew gentleness was never the whole truth. Jonathan cleared his throat. "The fund approved 72 students this year. I heard. Claire says the wording on the website is still too polished." "Claire is usually right. She misses your edits. I bill by the hour now." He laughed, then coughed into his glove. "Of course you do." Annie smiled. "Send it anyway." He looked at her with a quiet pride he did not try to own. "Your mother must be proud." "She is." Annie glanced toward the train station. "She still tells people I'm a lawyer before they ask her name." As she should. Annie rested a hand on the old book inside her tote. "She kept your words alive when you forgot them." "Yes," Jonathan said softly. "She did. And then you remembered. With help. With correction," Annie said. He accepted that too. A child laughed near the tree, bright against the cold. Annie watched Caleb packing his money carefully into his pocket while leaving the books out for one more customer. She recognized the posture, tired, hopeful, guarded, standing on the thin line between needing help and fearing what help might cost. She turned to Jonathan. "Do you know what my mother wrote in the book?" "Some of it. She wrote that help should not make you smaller." Jonathan looked toward Caleb. She was right, and justice should not require people to become symbols before they are seen. He nodded. "That should be on the foundation wall." "No," Annie said. "Put it on the application." Jonathan smiled. "Done." The snow thickened, softening the traffic noise. Annie buttoned her coat and prepared to leave. Jonathan stayed where he was, looking at the sidewalk, at the boy, at the people who stopped, and those who did not. "Annie," he said. She turned. "Thank you for not letting my worst moment be the last word." Annie considered that. Years ago, she might have answered sharply. Years had not made her less honest, only more careful with where she placed the blade. "You wrote the next word," she said. "I just made sure you didn't misspell it." Jonathan laughed, and this time the sound carried no bitterness. Annie walked toward the station with the dictionary, the old blue book, and the life she had built from work, love, anger, help, and refusal. Behind her, Caleb called out the price of another book. Ahead of her, the train lights glowed at the entrance. The sidewalk remained what it had always been, cold stone, public ground, a place where people hurried past. But that night, someone had stopped, and sometimes justice began that quietly, not with applause, not with headlines, but with a person refusing to let another person stand unseen. The lesson of this story is that dignity should never depend on wealth, status, or the opinion of strangers. Annie did not need pity. She needed a fair chance to use the strength she already had. Jonathan's mistake reminds us that success can make people forget the pain they once survived. But honesty and humility can bring them back to what matters. A real act of kindness does not make someone smaller. It opens a door, respects their voice, and lets them walk through with their head held high. Sometimes justice begins with something simple, noticing someone others ignore, admitting when we are wrong, and choosing to repair the harm we caused. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.